Hey guys, tonight we slip through the creaky wooden door of a medieval hovel, where the air smells of damp straw and flickering tallow candles cast shadows on rough-hewn walls. You're standing in the heart of the Middle Ages, a world where love, lust, and survival tangle in ways that might make your modern heart skip a beat. Picture yourself curling up on a lumpy straw mattress, the kind that crinkles under your weight, while outside, a rooster crows despite the late hour. This is no fairy tale romance novel. Sex in the Middle Ages was raw, complicated, and often a matter of life and death. Honestly, between the fleas and the church's watchful eye, you probably won't survive this unscathed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your city and the local time. I'm curious where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a peasant's home, a single room where the whole family, parents, kids, maybe a stray goat, sleeps together. Privacy, that's a modern luxury. The bed, if you can call it that, is a pile of straw or a crude wooden frame stuffed with wool, shared by everyone. Couples didn't get a candlelit room to themselves. They made do with a corner, maybe a tattered curtain if they were fancy. Mainstream history tells us that medieval households were multi-generational, with sleeping arrangements dictated by space, not modesty. You're trying to get romantic, but your mother-in-law's snoring 2 feet away, and the kids are wrestling nearby. Good luck setting the mood now. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some peasants believed sleeping under a heavy blanket could ward off evil spirits that might, disrupt their intimate moments. Superstition was huge. Imagine whispering sweet nothings while checking for demons under the bed. Historians still argue whether these shared sleeping spaces made people more open about sex, or just really good at ignoring each other. Either way, you're not slipping off to a private love nest. If you're lucky, the crackling fire drowns out any awkward sounds, but everyone knows what's happening. Let's talk about the bed itself. It's not just a place for sleep or sex, it's a status symbol. Wealthier folks had actual bed frames, maybe even a canopy to keep out the cold. But for you, a peasant, it's a scratchy pile that smells faintly of mildew. You're pulling your partner close, but there's no box spring for comfort, just the hard earth beneath. And don't forget the bugs, fleas, and lice were the uninvited guests at every medieval sleepover. Joke number 1. You thought your dating app matches were bad? Try flirting when you're both scratching flea bites mid-kiss. The church loomed large over every aspect of life, including what happened in that straw pile. Sex was supposed to be for procreation, not pleasure, and only in marriage. But let's be real, you're human, and humans find ways to bend rules. Some couples timed their moments for when the village was asleep, hoping the darkness hid their sins. Others, well, they just didn't care who heard. The lack of walls meant everyone was in on the gossip. And trust me, medieval villages thrived on it. You're also navigating a world where baths are rare. Hygiene wasn't a priority when survival meant hauling water from a freezing well. You might splash your face before a big night, but perfume, that's for nobles. Instead, you're masking the day's sweat with a sprig of lavender. If you're feeling extra. Joke number 2. Forget swiping right. You're just praying your crush doesn't smell like last week's porridge. This shared chaotic sleeping setup shaped how people viewed intimacy. It wasn't a private act, but a communal reality woven into the rhythm of daily life. You're not just stealing a moment with your partner. You're performing for an audience of snoring relatives and judgmental neighbors. And yet, Somehow, love or at least lust found a way. As you lie there, staring at the smoky ceiling, you realize medieval sex was less about romance and more about seizing fleeting moments in a world that didn't care about your comfort. You're trudging through a muddy village path, the kind that sucks at your boots with every step, as the smell of wood smoke and livestock hangs heavy in the air. It's market day, and you're a young peasant with your eye on someone special maybe. The miller's daughter with her quick laugh, or the blacksmith's son who's got arms like tree trunks. Love in the medieval village isn't about candlelit dinners or poetic sonnets. It's a practical, earthy affair where survival often trumps starry-eyed romance. You're not just looking for a soulmate. You're sizing up a partner who can plow a field or churn butter without complaining. Mainstream history shows us that peasant marriages were economic alliances, often arranged by families to pool resources or settle debts. You're not swiping through profiles. Your parents are haggling over a dowry of 2 goats and a sack of barley. Courtship was less will you be mine, and more can you keep us from starving? You're chatting up your crush by the well, but it's not all flirty banter. You're asking if they can handle a harvest or mend a leaky roof. Love might sneak in, but it's a bonus, not the goal. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some villages had a custom called bundling, where a courting couple could share a bed fully clothed, mind you, with a wooden board or a sack of grain between them to keep things chaste. Sounds romantic until you realize your future mother-in-law is watching from across the room, ready to whack you with a broom if you get too cozy. Historians still argue whether bundling was a sweet way to test compatibility or just a sneaky excuse for late-night cuddles. Either way, you're lying there, heart pounding, trying not to knock over the barrier while whispering about crop yields. The village square is your Tinder. You're stealing glances during church services or flirting at the annual fair, where ale flows and inhibitions loosen. But don't get to bold gossip spreads faster than a barn fire. If you're caught sneaking a kiss behind the haystack, the whole village will be clucking about it by sunrise. Joke number 1. Forget getting ghosted. You're dodging the priest's sermon about your wanton ways next Sunday. The church, always the mood killer, had strict rules about courtship. Sex before marriage was a sin, and betrothals were practically contracts. You're promising your hand in front of witnesses, and backing out could mean a fine or a public shaming. But let's be honest, plenty of couples jumped the gun. Hand-fasting ceremonies, where you'd clasp hands and vow to marry later, were common, and sometimes you'd seal the deal a bit early. If you catch my drift. The church grumbled, but villages often turned a blind eye as long as a wedding was on the horizon. You're also navigating a world where gender roles are ironclad. Men are expected to be providers, women to be homemakers and mothers. If you're a woman, your flirting is subtle, a smile, a lingering touch while passing bread. If you're a man, you're showing off by carrying an extra heavy sack of grain. Joke number 2. You thought modern dating was a performance? Try wooing someone by juggling turnips at the harvest dance. Seasons shaped your love life. 2. Spring and summer were prime courtship time, with long days and festivals to spark romance. Winter? You're huddled by the fire, too cold to think about anything but staying warm. And don't forget the practical side, marriage meant more hands for the harvest. So your parents are pushing you to seal the deal before planting season. Despite the pragmatism, there's a flicker of genuine affection in these courtships. You're stealing moments by the river, sharing a crust of bread, maybe even carving your initials into a tree if you're feeling bold. It's not the stuff of epic ballads, but it's real to people finding warmth in a hard world. Joke number 3. Your big romantic gesture, gifting a shiny apple instead of the wormy one. True love, medieval style, as you stand in the village square, watching your crush laugh with friends, you feel the weight of expectation. This isn't just about you, it's about family, land, and survival. But there's a spark in their eye that makes your heart race, and for a moment, you forget the mud, the church, and the looming winter. Love might be practical, but it's still a gamble worth taking. You're perched on a velvet cushion in a drafty stone castle, the kind where tapestries barely keep the chill at bay and candlelight dances on gilded goblets. You're no peasant now. You're rubbing elbows with nobles, where bedrooms are stages for scandal, power, and betrayal. The aristocratic bedchamber isn't just for sleeping or stolen kisses. It's a battlefield where alliances are forged, and one wrong move could send you to the chopping block. Love, that's a luxury. Lust, though, runs hotter than the hearth. Fire, and you're about to see how nobles played fast and loose with their vows. Mainstream history tells us that noble marriages were diplomatic chess moves, uniting houses or securing treaties. You're a lord or lady, wed to a stranger for land or loyalty, not love. Your wedding night might seal a peace deal, but by week 2, you're eyeing the charming knight or sly handmaiden across the hall. Infidelity was practically a sport among the elite. Everyone knew, but no one spoke it aloud unless it suited their agenda. You're sneaking through torchlit corridors, heart pounding, knowing a single whisper to the wrong ear could spark a feud. Here's a quirky tidbit. Nobles sometimes used bed curtains not just for warmth but to hide their extracurricular activities. Those heavy drapes muffled giggles and gasps, giving you a sliver of privacy in a castle full of spies. Historians still argue whether these affairs were rebellious acts of passion or calculated moves to curry favor. Picture yourself pulling those curtains tight, hoping the steward doesn't barge in with a tray of wine and a knowing smirk. The stakes are sky high. If you're a noblewoman, an affair could ruin your reputation, or worse, your husband might ship you to a nunnery. Men had more leeway, but a scorned wife with powerful kin could make your life hell. Joke number 1. You thought your ex's petty revenge was bad. Try dodging a vengeful duchess with her own private army. You're navigating a maze of etiquette, where a lingering glance at a banquet could be as dangerous as a dagger. The church, ever the buzzkill, condemned adultery as a mortal sin, but nobles often treated it like a suggestion. You're confessing your impure thoughts to a priest who's probably heard Jewish gossip from your rival. Some lords kept mistresses openly, housing them in manors while their wives gritted their teeth and plotted. Royal courts, like England's under Henry II, were hotbeds of intrigue. Think less Downton Abbey, more Game of Thrones, minus the dragons but with just as much backstabbing. Let's talk about the bedchamber itself. It's a far cry from the peasant's straw pile. You're sinking into a feather mattress, surrounded by embroidered hangings and furs. But don't get too cozy. Servants are always lurking, ready to report your every move. Your lover might slip in disguised as a page, and you're whispering sweet nothings while praying the floorboards don't creak. Joke number 2. Forget Netflix and chill. You're dodging nosy chambermaids and chill. Gender played a twisted role. Noblemen flaunted their conquests as badges of virility, while women had to be cunning. Think secret letters tucked into sleeves or rendezvous in the castle gardens. Some women, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, wielded their charm like a weapon, bending kings to their will. You're learning fast that sex isn't just pleasure, it's currency. A well-timed fling could win you a title or lose you a head. The fallout from these affairs was legendary. Take the scandal of Isabella of France, who allegedly took a lover and toppled her husband, Edward II. You're watching lords and ladies dance at a feast, but beneath the smiles, everyone's plotting your affair might be the spark that ignites a civil war. Joke number 3. You thought ghosting was rude? Try being exiled for sneaking a kiss with the wrong baron as you lie in that opulent bed. The weight of the castle presses down. Every creak could be a spy, every shadow a rival. Nobles lived for the thrill of forbidden love, but the cost was steep reputations shredded, alliances broken, sometimes blood spilled. You're not just chasing passion, you're gambling with your life. And yet, in the flicker of candlelight, you can't resist the pull of a whispered promise, even if it leads you straight to ruin. You're kneeling on a cold stone floor in a dimly lit church, the scent of incense curling around you like a judgmental ghost. Above, stained glass windows glow with saints who seem to stare right through your soul, and the priest's voice drones on about sin and salvation. In the Middle Ages, the church wasn't just a place for Sunday sermons, it was the ultimate rulemaker. In every corner of life, especially your bedroom, you're trying to navigate love or lust, but the church has a rule book thicker than a castle wall, and it's determined to keep your desires on a very short leash. Mainstream history confirms the Catholic Church held massive sway over medieval sexuality, dictating when, how, and with whom you could be intimate. Sex was a gift from God, but only for making babies pleasure for its own sake was a one-way ticket to eternal barbecue. You're married, great, but don't get too frisky. The church says you can only do the deed on certain days, avoiding Sundays, Lent, and a laundry list of holy feasts. You're counting days on your fingers, wondering if you'll ever get a green light. Breaking these rules, that's a confession session where the priest might assign you a month of bread and water penance. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some churchmen believed specific positions were sinful because they were too enjoyable. You're trying to keep things holy, but now you're second-guessing your every move, wondering if you're accidentally damned for getting creative. Historians still argue whether these rules were strictly enforced, or if priests just winked at couples who fudged the calendar. Either way, you're whispering to your spouse about timing, hoping the neighbors don't overhear and tattle to the bishop. The church's obsession with control went beyond schedules. Premarital sex, adultery, and anything outside marriage were branded as mortal sins. You're sneaking a kiss with your betrothed, but if you go too far, you're risking public shaming. Think standing in church in a white sheet, while the congregation side-eyes you. Joke number 1. You thought your group chat blowing up was bad? Try the whole village gossiping about your unchaste hug. Marriage itself was a sacrament, and the church made sure you knew it was a contract, not a rom-com. You're vowing to love and honor, but the fine print says your body belongs to your spouse and God, not you. Refusing sex with your partner, that's a sin called denying the marital debt. You're grumbling about a headache, but the priest says tough luck, get to it, or you're defying divine will. Meanwhile, the church frowned on too much passion, even in marriage. Love your spouse too much? That's idolatry. You're walking a tightrope, and the fall is steep. Let's talk confession, the medieval equivalent of airing your dirty laundry. You're kneeling in a wooden booth, spilling your secrets to a priest, who might be your neighbor's cousin. Every lustful thought, every stolen glance, has to be confessed. The penance could be prayers, fasting, or even a pilgrimage to a far-off shrine. Joke number 2. Forget oversharing on social media. You're bearing your soul while Father Thomas judges your crush on the baker. The church's rules hit women hardest. You're a woman, and your virtue is everyone's business. A single rumor could ruin you, while men got a slap on the wrist. The church preached that women were temptresses, descendants of Eve, luring men to sin. You're keeping your eyes down, but the sermons keep hammering that your very existence is a moral hazard. Yet, some women found loopholes. Nuns, for instance, could dodge marriage but faced their own battles with desire, as we'll see later. Despite the restrictions, people bent the rules. Your sneaking moments when the church wasn't looking, maybe during a festival when the priest was too drunk to care, the church could preach. But human nature had its own agenda. Joke number 3. You thought sneaking snacks past your diet app was rebellious? Try sneaking a cuddle past a bishop with a vendetta as you rise from the church pew. The weight of those rules lingers. You're human, with a heart that races and a body that yearns. But the church wants your soul on lockdown. Every step feels like a dance between desire and damnation, and you're not sure if you're winning or just surviving. But in the quiet of the night, you'll find ways to steal a little warmth, even if it means outsmarting the saints themselves. You're standing in a grand hall, its walls draped with tapestries of mythical beasts. As the clink of goblets and nervous laughter fills the air, it's your wedding night, and you're a noble, decked out in silks that itch more than impress. The bedchamber awaits, its massive 4-poster bed looming like a stage for a high-stakes performance. This isn't just a night of love or lust, it's a political spectacle, where consummation seals alliances and secures legacies. You're sweating, not from passion, but from the eyes of the court watching your every move. Welcome to the medieval wedding night, where the pressure's hotter than the hearth. Mainstream history tells us that for nobles, the wedding night was a public affair, often witnessed to prove the marriage was binding. You're not slipping away for a private moment. A gaggle of relatives, priests, and nosy courtiers might be lingering just outside the curtains or worse, inside the room. Their job, to confirm you've done the deed, ensuring no one can later claim the marriage was invalid. You're trying to focus on your new spouse, but the bishop's scribbling notes, and your uncle's cracking jokes about heirs. Talk about a mood killer. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some regions, nobles used a bridal ale laced with herbs like saffron, believed to boost stamina for the big night. You're sipping this questionable brew, wondering if it's a love potion or just spicy soup. Historians still argue whether these public consummations were standard or reserved for disputed unions. But either way, you're performing under pressure that'd make a modern reality show blush. The bed itself is a symbol of power, piled with furs and embroidered with your family's crest. You're climbing in, but it's not just about you and your spouse, it's about dynasties. If you're a bride, the expectation is clear. Produce an heir, pronto. If you're the groom, you're proving your virility to a room full of skeptics. Joke number 1. You thought your first date was awkward? Try getting romantic while your in-laws bet on how fast you'll finish. The church, as always, has its clause. In this moment, sex is holy, but only if it follows the script: procreation, not pleasure. You're whispering sweet nothings, but in the back of your mind, you're tallying forbidden days to avoid a sermon later. And if the marriage isn't consummated, that's grounds for annulment, which could unravel treaties or spark wars. You're not just making love, you're making history. And the stakes are dizzying. Let's talk about the bride's side. If you're her, you're likely young, maybe 15, and terrified. Virginity is your currency, and the bloody bedsheet might be paraded tomorrow as proof of your purity. It's not uncommon for families to fake it with a vial of chicken blood, just in case. You're clutching your new husband's hand, hoping he's gentle, but knowing the court gossip will outlive you both. Men, meanwhile, face their own pressure. Impotence rumors could ruin a lord's reputation faster than a lost battle. The aftermath is just as intense. You're waking up to servants whispering and messengers galloping off to announce the deed. If you're lucky, the court's satisfied, and you're left alone. If not, you're dodging accusations of infertility, or worse, sorcery. Joke number 2. Forget posting your relationship status online. Your bedroom success is broadcast to half the kingdom by noon. Despite the spectacle, there's a flicker of humanity in this moment. You're stealing glances at your spouse, maybe finding a spark of warmth amid the chaos. Some couples grew to love each other, forging bonds that outlasted the politics. Others, well, they gritted their teeth and got it over with, already plotting their next move. The bedchamber was a battlefield, but it was also a rare space where two people could, for a moment, be more than pawns. As you lie back, the weight of the night settles. You've survived the scrutiny, but the memory of those watching eyes lingers. Joke number 3. You thought stage fright was bad? Try performing for a crowd that's judging your family tree. This wedding night wasn't about romance, it was about power, duty, and a legacy that could shape kingdoms. Yet, in the quiet after the crowd departs, you feel a fleeting connection, a shared secret that's yours alone, even if the world outside claims it. You're back in the muck of a medieval village, ankle deep in mud that smells like it's been brewing since last harvest. The thatched roofs sag under the weight of drizzle, and you're weaving through a crowd of peasants hauling baskets of turnips. You've heard the tales of rustic romance, passionate flings in haylofts, stolen kisses under starry skies. But let's debunk some myths about peasant passion. Life in the village was less about sweeping love stories and more about grit, sweat, and making it through another winter. You're not living a pastoral fantasy. You're dodging cow dung while trying to flirt. Mainstream history shows that peasant life was a grind, leaving little room for the kind of romance you'd see in a modern movie. You're up before dawn, milking goats or threshing grain, and, by nightfall, you're too exhausted to whisper sweet nothings. Sex wasn't a grand affair, it was squeezed into rare moments between chores, often in the same room as your snoring kin. As we saw back in that crowded hovel, the idea of the carefree peasant lover, that's a myth spun by later poets who never shoveled manure. You're more likely to bond over a shared wheel of cheese than a bouquet of wildflowers. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some villages believed that rolling in a field at midnight could boost fertility, so you might catch couples sneaking out, giggling, as they tumble through the grass. It's less romantic when you realize they're dodging nettles and praying for a baby to help with next year's harvest. Historians still argue whether these rituals were about love or just desperate attempts to secure a family's future. Either way, you're brushing dirt off your tunic, hoping the moon hides your blush. Let's bust another myth, the lusty peasant stereotype. You've heard stories of bawdy villagers hopping into bed with anyone, but reality was tamer. The church's rules, as we've seen, clamped down hard on extramarital fun, and village gossip was brutal. You're stealing a glance at the shepherd's daughter, but one wrong move, and you're the talk of the alehouse. Joke number 1. You thought getting cancelled online was rough? Try being shunned at the village well for a flirty wink. Practicality ruled everything. You're not chasing passion. You're chasing a partner who can mend a fence or bake bread that doesn't break your teeth. Marriages were often arranged, and love was a slow burn, if it came at all. You're sharing a bed with your spouse, but it's less about sparks and more about warmth, literal warmth, since winters are brutal, and that straw mattress is thin. The romantic hayloft, sure, It exists, but it's prickly, damp, and probably home to a family of rats. Disease and malnutrition didn't help. You're not exactly feeling amorous when your teeth ache from scurvy or your stomach's growling. Hygiene, as we've noted, was a low priority. Baths were a once-a-month luxury. If that, you're trying to charm someone, but you both smell like a mix of sweat and smoked herring. Joke number 2. Forget love at first sight. You're just hoping they don't notice your unwashed tunic. The church's shadow loomed large, preaching that sex was for procreation, not pleasure. You're dodging sermons about hellfire while trying to steal a moment by the barn. Some couples got creative, timing their trysts for festivals when the priest was distracted by mead. But the community enforced its own rules. Step out of line, and you're facing a fine or a public scolding. You're keeping your head down, knowing one rumor could cost you dearly. Despite the grind, there was room for tenderness. You're sharing a rare quiet moment, maybe laughing over a jug of ale or dancing at a harvest feast. These weren't grand gestures, but small defiance against a hard life. Joke number 3. You thought a heart eyes emoji was romantic. Try gifting a potato that's only half rotten. That's peasant love as you trudge back to your hut. The myths of rustic passion fade. Life here is raw, and so is love. Less about poetry, more about partnership. You're not chasing fairy tales. You're building a life, one muddy step at a time. And when you catch your partner's eye across the fire, there's a warmth that no myth can outshine, even if it smells faintly of onions. You're hunched over a rickety table in a dimly lit hut, the air thick with the scent of herbs and something faintly sour, like milk gone bad. A village wise woman, her fingers stained with berry juice, is grinding a dubious mix of roots and leaves, muttering about keeping the wound quiet. You're here because you and your spouse aren't ready for another mouth to feed. Last year's harvest was lean, and the cow's milk is already thin. Welcome to the wild world of medieval contraception, where folklore, desperation, and a pinch of magic collide in a brew that's as likely to make you queasy as it is to work. Mainstream history tells us that medieval people were keenly aware of the burdens of large families, especially peasants who couldn't afford extra hands until children were old enough to work. The church preached that interfering with conception was a sin. But you're not alone in seeking ways to dodge another pregnancy. Methods were passed down in whispers, often by women like this wise woman, who knew more about bodies than any university-trained physician. You're eyeing her mortar and pestle, wondering if you're about to drink a miracle or a mistake. Here's a quirky tidbit. One popular contraceptive was a paste made from crocodile dung, believed to block the womb if, well, applied strategically. You're grimacing at the thought. Crocodiles weren't exactly roaming the English countryside, so local substitutes like sheep droppings were used instead. Historians still argue whether these remedies were effective or just gross placebos that made couples think twice about getting frisky. Either way, you're praying this potion doesn't taste as bad as it smells. The church's rules, as we've seen, were a constant hurdle. Blocking conception was seen as defying God's plan, and confessing such acts could earn you a stern penance. You're keeping this visit secret, knowing one nosy neighbor could land you in hot water. Joke number 1. You thought sneaking a late-night snack was risky? Try smuggling a bag of dubious herbs past the village gossip. Other methods were less stomach-churning but just as bizarre. You're hearing tales of amulets stuffed with weasel bones, worn to ward off pregnancy, or drinking rue tea, which might prevent conception but could also leave you doubled over with cramps. Some couples relied on timing, avoiding the fertile days as best they could. Though medieval knowledge of ovulation was shakier than a poorly built bridge. You're counting moons and hoping for the best. But it's more guesswork than science. Men weren't off the hook. You're hearing whispers of linen sheaths tied with a bit of string, early condoms. Used more for disease prevention than contraception. But still a bold move in a world where every act was scrutinized. These were rare, though, and mostly for the wealthy who could afford such novelties. You're a peasant, so you're stuck with the wise woman's brew. Crossing your fingers it doesn't backfire. The risks weren't just spiritual. Some concoctions, like those with mercury or lead, were downright toxic. You're sipping this herbal sludge, wondering if you'll wake up with a baby or a bellyache or worse. Women bore the brunt of these dangers, as they did with most reproductive matters. You're marveling at the wise woman's confidence, but there's a flicker of fear in her eyes. Too, she knows the stakes if her remedy fails. Despite the church's grip, practicality often won out. You're not the only one sneaking to this hut. Half the village women have been here, trading eggs or a bit of cloth for a chance to space their children. Joke number 2. Forget dodging spam calls. You're dodging the priest's questions about why your family's still small. These methods weren't foolproof, but they were a quiet rebellion against a world that demanded endless heirs. There was a softer side, too. You're talking with your spouse late at night, sharing fears about another pregnancy, another winter with too little food. These conversations, hushed under a scratchy blanket, build trust in a way sermons never could. Joke number 3. You thought couples therapy was modern? Try bonding over a shared dread of crocodile paste as you leave the wise woman's hut. Clutching a small vial, the weight of your choice settles in. You're defying the church, risking your health, all for a sliver of control in a chaotic world. The potion might work, or it might not, but for now, you're holding onto hope hand. Maybe a strong stomach. You're sitting in the flickering glow of a village church, the wooden pew creaking under you as the priest's voice booms about the fires of hell, awaiting the lustful. His sermon's a familiar one, painting sex as a slippery slope to sin, a trap set by the devil to snare your soul. In the Middle Ages, the church didn't just regulate your bedroom, it obsessed over every thought, glance, or tingle that might lead you astray. You're trying to keep your eyes on the crucifix, but your mind's wandering to last night's stolen moment by the fire, and now you're sweating, wondering if God's taking notes. Mainstream history shows the church framed sex as a necessary evil, permissible only for procreation within marriage. Pleasure was suspect, a distraction from divine love. You're married, so you're technically in the clear. But the church says too much enthusiasm even with your spouse is a sin called uxoriousness. You're replaying last night, second-guessing if you enjoyed it a bit too much. The church's grip was so tight that it published guides, like penitentials, listing sexual sins and their punishments, from fasting to flogging. You're clutching your rosary, hoping your confession stays vague. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some theologians claim nocturnal emissions were the work of demons called succubi, sneaking into men's dreams to steal their virtue. You're waking up in a cold sweat, wondering if that weird dream about the miller's wife was your fault or Satan's. Historians still argue whether these beliefs genuinely terrified people, or if they were just clerical scare tactics to keep everyone in line. Either way, you're double-checking your prayers before bed, just in case a demon's lurking. The church's fixation on sin made sex a moral minefield. You're navigating a world where even thinking about your neighbor's comely smile could land you in spiritual hot water. Confession was your only out, but spilling your secrets to a priest, often a local, Who knew your whole family was like posting your diary in the village square? You're mumbling about impure thoughts. Praying Father William doesn't connect the dots. Joke number 1. You thought oversharing on social media was bad? Try confessing your crush to a priest who's best buds with your mother-in-law. Gender played a brutal role. Women were seen as the spark of temptation. Their bodies a constant threat to men's piety. You're a woman, and every sermon reminds you that Eve's legacy means you're one sultry glance away from ruining a man's soul. Men, meanwhile, were urged to control their urges, but often got a pass for slipping after all. Women were the real culprits. You're biting your tongue, knowing the double standard stings worse than the priest's lecture. The church didn't stop at sermons. It enforced its rules through ecclesiastical courts, where you could be hauled in for adultery, fornication, or even lewd behavior like holding hands too long. Penalties ranged from public shaming to excommunication, which was social death in a world where the church was your ticket to heaven. You're keeping your head down, but the fear of being called out hangs like damp fog. Joke number 2. Forget a bad Yelp review. Try standing in church while the priest lists your sins to the congregation. Despite the fear-mongering, people pushed back. You're hearing whispers of couples who laughed off the rules. Sneaking moments when the church wasn't looking. Festivals, with their flowing ale and loosened morals, were prime time for bending the rules. The church could preach, but it couldn't watch you every second. Some scholars even suggest the obsession with sin made sex more alluring. Nothing says do it like a forbidden label. There was a human side, too. You're lying awake, wrestling with guilt but also with love for your partner. The church says it's sin, but the warmth of their hand feels like the opposite. You're caught between divine law and human need, and it's a tug of war that leaves you dizzy. Joke number 3. You thought mixed signals from a date were confusing? Try decoding God's will while your heart's doing BACKFLIPS as you leave. The church, the priest's words echo, but so does the memory of that fireside moment. The church wants your soul pure, but your heart's got other plans. You're walking a tightrope, balancing fear and desire, and every step feels like a quiet rebellion against a God who's watching a little too closely. You're lounging in a royal bedchamber, its walls hung with velvet and gold-threaded tapestries, the air heavy with the scent of beeswax candles and ambition. This isn't just a bedroom, it's a political chessboard where every kiss, caress, or conception could shift the fate of kingdoms. You're a courtier, maybe a king's cousin or a queen's confidant, watching how sex weaves through the power plays of the medieval elite. In the royal court, love is a weapon, lust is a strategy, and the bed is where dynasties are born or broken. You're keeping your ears sharp, because one whispered scandal could change everything. Mainstream history shows that royal marriages were high-stakes diplomacy, forged to unite realms or secure alliances. You're a prince, wed to a foreign princess you've barely met, and your job is to produce an heir to cement the treaty. But it's not just about babies. Your bedroom antics signal strength or weakness to rivals. A king with no heir, like Henry VI of England, could destabilize a realm, while a fertile queen, like Catherine of Aragon, was a walking insurance policy. You're under pressure to perform, knowing every courtier's betting on your success or failure. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some royals used bedding ceremonies to flaunt their virility, parading the newlyweds to bed with music and body jokes, as if it were a state event. Your blushing as minstrels serenade your every move, wondering if they'll write a ballad about your stamina. Historians still argue whether these rituals were about propaganda or just noble bragging rights. Either way, You're pulling the bed curtains tight, hoping the crowd outside doesn't start a play. The bedchamber was a hot spot for intrigue. You're overhearing whispers of mistresses tucked away in secret manners, their children sometimes legitimized to bolster a shaky throne. Kings like Edward IV juggled lovers and wives, each liaison a potential diplomatic bomb. If you're a queen, your fidelity is non-negotiable. One hint of an affair, and your child's claim to the throne is toast. You're dodging spies who love to catch you with a charming duke. Joke number 1. You thought office gossip was vicious? Try a court where your love life could spark a civil war. Sex also meant leverage. You're a lady-in-waiting, and a royal fling could win you a title or a one-way trip to exile. Men used mistresses to flex power, but women like in Berlin turned the game on its head, wielding charm to climb from mistress to queen. You're learning fast that every flirtation is a calculated risk, and the reward might be a crown or a noose. The church, as we've seen, condemned extramarital dalliances, but royals often bent the rules, buying forgiveness with hefty donations. The physical space mattered, too. You're in a bed so massive it's practically a fortress, carved with lions and roses to scream power. But it's not. Private servants, guards, and scheming nobles are never far. You're whispering plans with your lover, but the walls have ears, and a careless word could reach the wrong king. Joke number 2. Forget worrying about your phone being hacked. Try keeping a secret when your chambermaids on the rival dukes. Payroll heirs were the ultimate prize. You're praying for a son, because a daughter, while useful for alliances, won't silence the nobles clamoring for a male king. Infertility was a crisis. Rumors of curses or divine wrath could topple a dynasty. You're watching queens drink bizarre tonics, like ground stag antler, to boost fertility, while kings consulted astrologers for the best conception dates. Failure meant whispers of annulment or worse, as Henry VIII's wives learned the hard way. Despite the scheming, there was humanity in these games. You're catching a rare moment where a king and queen share a quiet laugh, their hands brushing under the furs. Power drove them, but sometimes, so did affection. Joke number 3. You thought a power couple was impressive? Try ruling a kingdom and still finding time for a cuddle. As you slip out of the bedchamber, the weight of its secrets lingers. Every act here ripples outward, shaping wars, treaties, and bloodlines. You're not just a bystander, you're part of a world where desire and duty collide. And the bed is the most dangerous throne of all. One wrong move, and you're not just out of favor, you're out of time. You're weaving through a crowded street in a medieval town, the air thick with the stench of open sewers and the tang of cheap ale. Shouts of hawkers mix with the giggles of women, leaning from upper windows, their brightly dyed dresses signaling their trade. You're in the shadow of a brothel, its wooden sign creaking in the wind, and the reality of medieval prostitution hits you like a slap. This isn't the glamorous underworld of tavern songs, it's a grim, gritty world where survival comes at a brutal cost. And you're about to see what life was like for those who sold their bodies to scrape by. Mainstream history tells us prostitution was widespread in medieval Europe, often regulated by towns to keep it contained. You're passing stews or bathhouses that double as brothels, where workers catered to merchants, soldiers, and even the occasional clergyman. Cities like London and Paris had designated areas, like Southwark's Bankside, where brothels operated under the watchful eye of local officials. You're dodging drunken patrons, but the women inside face far worse: disease, violence, and a society that brands them as outcasts while profiting from their work. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some brothels were run by the church itself, with Bishops collecting rent from sinful establishments to fund holy causes. You're raising an eyebrow, wondering how the same priest preaching against lust is pocketing your coin from last night's visit. Historians still argue whether this was pragmatic hypocrisy or just medieval business as usual. Either way, you're treading carefully, knowing the church's rules bend when gold's involved. Just like we saw in those royal bedchambers, life for these women or sometimes men was relentless. You're peering into a cramped room where a worker negotiates with a client over a flickering candle. She's likely a runaway peasant or a widow with no other way to eat. The pay is meager, and the risks are high. Syphilis and other diseases were rampant, with no cure in sight. You're wincing at the thought of treatments like mercury salves that burned more than they healed. Joke number 1. You thought a bad Tinder date was rough? Try bargaining with a sailor who smells like a week-old fish. The church, as we've seen, condemned prostitution as a mortal sin, but society turned a blind eye when it suited them. You're hearing tales of penitent Magdalenes, women who left the trade for convents, but most faced a lifetime of scorn. Secular laws were harsh. Prostitutes could be fined, whipped, or banished. Yet the demand never waned. You're watching a town official collect a tax from a brothel keeper. Proof that morality took a back seat to money. Some towns even mandated distinctive clothing, like yellow cloaks, to mark prostitutes, making them easy targets for judgment or worse. Violence was a constant shadow. You're catching a glimpse of a woman nursing a bruised cheek, her eyes hard but weary. Clients could be rough, and brothel keepers weren't always protective. If you're a worker, you're balancing charm with caution, knowing one wrong word could earn you a beating. Legal protection, barely. Courts rarely sided with prostitutes, even when they were victims. You're feeling the weight of their vulnerability, a stark contrast to the nobles' gilded affairs we explored earlier. There was a strange community, though. You're noticing workers sharing a laugh over a jug of ale, swapping stories of stingy clients or absurd requests. These moments of camaraderie were lifelines in a world that offered little kindness. Some brothels even had their own hierarchies, with veteran workers mentoring newcomers. Joke number 2. Forget office politics. Try navigating who gets the best corner in a crowded stew. The clients weren't all villains. You're overhearing a young apprentice, nervous and fumbling, visiting for the first time. For some, brothels were a rite of passage. For others, a fleeting escape from a loveless marriage or monastic vows. But the power imbalance was clear. You're seeing the worker's smile, but her eyes are calculating, always on guard. The church might call her a sinner, but you're wondering who's really exploiting whom as you leave the street. The brothel's laughter fades, replaced by the clatter of carts and distant church bells. You're struck by the hypocrisy, a world that damns these women yet thrives on their labor. Joke number 3. You thought dodging a parking ticket was tricky? Try dodging salvation while everyone's cashing in on your sin. This was no life of glamour, just a raw fight to survive in a society that judged but never looked away. You're slipping through the narrow streets of a medieval town at dusk, where torchlight flickers on cobblestones and whispers carry on the evening breeze. You're catching snippets of gossip, 2 men sharing a lingering glance at the tavern, a woman brushing another's hand behind the market stalls. These aren't the usual tales of village romance. They're the hidden stories of same-sex desires, cloaked in secrecy and danger. In the Middle Ages, love and lust between those of the same gender existed, but they thrived in the shadows, shaped by a society that both condemned and quietly acknowledged them. You're treading softly, knowing one wrong word could unravel lives. Mainstream history tells us that same-sex relationships were documented across medieval Europe, though often through the lens of church records or court trials. You're hearing of sodomy, a catch-all term for acts the church deemed unnatural, which could include anything from same-sex intimacy to bestiality. Punishments were severe fines, exile, or even death by burning in extreme cases, especially later in the period. Yet, you're noticing that enforcement varied wildly. In some towns, authorities turned a blind eye unless someone made a public fuss. You're keeping your head down, aware that silence is safer than scandal. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval love poetry, like that from 12th century monks, drips with homoerotic longing, describing beloved brothers in terms that make you blush. You're wondering if these were chaste spiritual bonds or coded confessions of something more. Historians still argue whether these writings reflect physical relationships or just intense platonic devotion. Either way, you're picturing a monk, scribbling by candlelight, his heart racing as he pens words he can never speak aloud. The church, as we've seen, was the loudest voice against same-sex acts, branding them as sins against nature. You're sitting through another sermon, the priest thundering about Sodom and Gomorrah, and you're glancing at the man beside you, wondering if he's hiding the same secret. Confession was a trap admitting such desires could lead to penance, or worse, so you're keeping your thoughts locked tight. Joke number 1. You thought keeping a secret crush quiet was hard. Try hiding it from a priest who thinks God's got a direct line to your soul. Despite the risks, these relationships found space to breathe. You're hearing of all-male guilds or monasteries where close bonds sometimes crossed into intimacy, shielded by the lack of women and the vow of secrecy. Women, too, formed deep connections, especially in convents or among widows living together. You're imagining two women weaving side by side, their fingers brushing, their laughter a private code. But the stakes were higher for women. Accusations of unnatural behavior could ruin their already fragile social standing. Secular society wasn't always kinder. You're catching wind of a trial where two men were caught, their names dragged through the mud while the town buzzed with gossip. Public shaming was common, but so was discretion. Many lived quietly, their relationships known only to trusted friends. You're marveling at the courage it took to love in a world so quick to judge. Joke number 2. Forget dodging awkward family dinners. Try dodging a mob with torches and pitchforks. There were loopholes, though. You're learning about sworn brotherhood ceremonies, where two men could pledge loyalty in a church, their bonds sealed with a kiss. Was it platonic, or a clever cover for something deeper? You're raising an eyebrow, suspecting some couples played the system like pros. These rituals gave a veneer of respectability, letting love hide in plain sight. The church might scowl, but it couldn't police every heart. The human side shines through. You're picturing a quiet moment of friends sharing a jug of ale, their knees touching under the table, stealing a glance that says more than words. These were acts of defiance, small but seismic, against a world that demanded conformity. Joke number 3. You thought sneaking a text to your crush was bold. Try passing a love note when the penalties appear as you leave the town's shadows. The weight of those hidden lives lingers. You're struck by their resilience, loving fiercely despite the odds, finding joy in stolen moments. The Middle Ages weren't all fire and brimstone. They were also about hearts that refused to be silenced, even when the world demanded they whisper. You're carrying their secrets now, a quiet honor in a noisy world. You're sitting in a dimly lit room, the air heavy with the scent of old parchment and bitter herbs. As a physician, in a long robe scribbles on a wax tablet, His shelves are crammed with jars of leeches and powders, and he's muttering about humors and celestial alignments while diagnosing your fertility troubles. In the Middle Ages, medical ideas about sex and conception were a wild mix of ancient texts, folklore, and outright guesswork. You're trying not to laugh as he explains how your love life hinges on the position of Venus or the balance of your bile. These theories shaped how people understood their bodies, and trust me, they're as bizarre as they sound. Mainstream history shows that medieval medicine leaned heavily on Greek and Roman thinkers like Galen, who tied sex to the bodies. For humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. You're being told that conception requires a balanced body. So if you're too hot, cold, wet, or dry, your chances of a baby are slim. The physicians prescribing a diet of boiled nettles to warm your womb, or advising your husband to avoid baths, lest they sap his vital heat. You're nodding politely, but you're wondering if this guy's ever met an actual human. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some doctors believed women needed to enjoy themselves for conception to occur, claiming a female seed was released only during pleasure. You're blushing as the physician winks, suggesting you take delight in your husband's embrace. Historians still argue whether this idea empowered women or just piled on more pressure to perform. Either way, you're leaving this consultation with a mix of embarrassment and a recipe for spiced wine to stir the passions. The church, as we've seen, loomed over everything, and its influence crept into medicine. Sex was for procreation, so any act that didn't aim for a baby like certain positions or timing was suspect. You're being lectured on natural ways to conceive, but the physician's dodging the church's glare, knowing his remedies flirt with sin. Joke number 1. You thought health apps were intrusive? Try a doctor who blames your barrenness on a misaligned star and a lustful heart. Medieval ideas about bodies were hilariously off base. You're hearing that men's seed was cooked in the body's heat, while women's colder nature made them mere vessels for it. This led to wild advice, like men eating spicy foods to boost their fire, or women lying still post-stacked to hold the seed. You're picturing couples following these rules like a bizarre recipe, hoping for a son but getting a headache instead. And don't get me started on the belief that a woman's thoughts during sex could shape the baby thin about a fox, and you might birth a trickster. Infertility was a crisis, especially for nobles, as we saw in those royal bedchambers. You're being offered charms, like a rabbit's foot tied to your waist, or prayers to Saint Margaret, patron of childbirth. If that fails, the physician might hint at demonic interference because nothing says try again like accusing your womb of witchcraft. You're rolling your eyes, but the fear of being labeled cursed is real, especially for women. Men weren't spared the nonsense. You're a husband, and the physician's blaming your weak seed on too much ale or a chilly bedroom. His fix, a poultice of ground worms applied. Well, you don't want to know where. You're wincing, wondering why you didn't just stick to prayers. Joke number 2. Forget Jim Brothers obsessing over protein shakes. Try a medieval guy slathering on worm paste for virility. Despite the absurdity, there was a human side. You're talking with your spouse, sharing worries about a childless future, and these consultations, however wacky, offered hope. Couples clung to every remedy, from lunar calendars to herbal brews, because a baby meant security, more hands for the harvest, or a legacy for the throne. The physician's confidence, even if misplaced, gave you something to hold onto in a world where so much was uncertain. As you leave the physician's den, clutching a vial of dubious tonic, you're torn between laughter and dread. These medical myths shaped lives, for better or worse, and you're carrying their weight. Joke number 3. You thought webbed was a rabbit hole? Try trusting a guy who thinks your love life depends on Jupiter and a good stew. You're stepping back into the world, hoping for a miracle but bracing for a bellyache, one strange theory at a time. You're hiding in the shadowy corner of a castle stable, the air thick with the scent of hay and horse sweat. Your heart pounding as you steal a glance at your lover, a knight whose charm outshines his dented armor. You're a noble, and this affair is a dangerous thrill, a secret that could cost you everything. Adultery in the Middle Ages wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a social earthquake, shaking family honor, alliances, and sometimes entire kingdoms. You're clutching a stolen glove, a token of forbidden love, but the fallout of this liaison is creeping closer, and you're not sure if you'll escape unscathed. Mainstream history tells us that adultery among nobles was a high-stakes crime, often punished harshly to protect lineage and property. If you're a woman, like the infamous Guinevere of legend, your affair could lead to disgrace, banishment, or worse, execution in extreme cases, as seen in some 13th century courts. Men faced less severe consequences, but a cuckolded husband with powerful kin could demand blood or gold. You're whispering promises in the dark, but every creak of the stable door makes you flinch, knowing discovery could unravel your world. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some nobles used coded love tokens, like a ribbon or a carved ring, to signal their affairs without leaving a paper trail. You're tucking that glove into your sleeve, hoping no servant spots it and starts whispering. Historians still argue whether these tokens were romantic gestures or practical tools to avoid detection. Either way, you're praying your husband doesn't notice your sudden fondness for a particular shade of green. The church, as we've seen, branded adultery a mortal sin, preaching hellfire for straying spouses. You're dreading confession, where you'll have to mumble something vague to avoid a penance that could tip off your spouse. Secular laws were just as brutal. Adulterous women could lose their dowry or be sent to a convent, while men might face fines or duels. You're recalling tales of lords like Philip Augustus of France, whose marital scandals sparked diplomatic crises. Joke number 1. You thought a bad breakup text was rough? Try dodging a husband who's got a sword and a grudge. The fallout wasn't just personal. You're a noblewoman, and your affair threatens the legitimacy of your children, which could ignite a succession war. If your husband suspects your son isn't his, he might disinherit him, leaving your family's lands in chaos. You're lying awake, replaying every glance you've shared with your lover, wondering if the court's already buzzing. Men, too, faced risks. A scorned wife with influential brothers could rally allies to ruin you. You're navigating a web of loyalties, and one snapped thread could bring it all down. Society's double standards stung. You're a woman, and your virtue is the family's honor. Step out of line, and you're a harlot. Men, they're winked at, their flings dismissed as sowing oats. You're fuming at the unfairness, but you're also calculating, using your charm to keep allies close and enemies guessing. Some women, like those in the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine, turned scandal into power. But you're not sure you've got that kind of nerve. The affair's thrill is fading under the weight of fear. You're meeting your lover in snatched moments behind the chapel, in a secluded garden, each rendezvous a gamble. Servants are the worst spies. One bribed maid could sell you out to your husband or a rival. You're remembering those royal bedchamber intrigues, where a whisper could topple a dynasty. Joke number 2. Forget worrying about your phone's location tracking. Try keeping a secret when every castle wall's got ears. There's a human side, though. You're stealing a quiet moment, your lover's hand warm against yours, and for a second, the world's judgment fades. This isn't just lust, it's a rebellion against a marriage you didn't choose, a life you didn't shape. But the stables, shadows can't hide you forever. You're hearing rumors your husband's been too quiet. His steward's been asking questions. The glove in your sleeve feels heavier now, a tether to a love that might burn you both. As you slip back to the castle, the night feels colder. You're carrying the weight of a choice that could rewrite your fate: honor, exile, or worse. Joke. Number 3. You thought ghosting someone was cold? Try ending an affair when your lover's got a lance and your husband's got a dungeon. Adultery was a spark in a powder keg, and you're standing too close to the flame, wondering if love was worth the ruin it might bring. You're standing in a bustling village square, the air alive with the chatter of merchants and the clang of a blacksmith's hammer. But all eyes are on a young woman passing by, her head held high despite the whispers trailing her. She's unmarried, untouched at least. She'd better be, because in the Middle Ages, a woman's virginity was more than a personal matter. It was a cultural obsession, a currency that could make or break families, alliances, and futures. You're watching the scrutiny she faces, feeling the weight of a society that measures her worth by her purity. And you're about to dive into why this fixation ran so deep. Mainstream history tells us that virginity, especially for women, was tied to family honor and property rights. You're a maiden, and your chastity is your dowry's golden ticket proof. You're a pure bride who won't bring a cuckoo into the family nest. Noble families, as we saw in those royal bedchambers, staked their legacies on it. A questionable heir could spark wars. For peasants, it was less dramatic but still crucial. A virgin bride meant a respectable match, maybe a better plot of land. You're dodging leering glances, knowing one rumor could tank your marriage prospects. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some communities used virginity tests, like checking for a maiden's intactness before a wedding, often with midwives acting as medieval lie detectors. You're cringing at the thought of such an invasion, wondering if the midwife's getting kickbacks to fudge the results. Historians still argue whether these tests were common or just a scare tactic to keep women in line. Either way, you're praying you never end up under that kind of spotlight, with the whole village waiting for a thumbs dash up. The church, as we've seen, was the loudest cheerleader for chastity. Virginity was next to godliness, with figures like the Virgin Mary as the ultimate role model. You're hearing sermons that praise celibacy over marriage, urging you to stay unspoiled for God. If you're a noble woman, your virginity might be your ticket to a powerful match. If you're a peasant, it's your shield against being labeled a harlot, losing it outside marriage. That's a scandal that could land you in a church court, facing fines or public penance. You're keeping your distance from that charming miller's son, just in case. The obsession wasn't just spiritual, it was practical. You're a father, and your daughter's purity secures a good groom, maybe one with a few extra sheep. If you're a bride, your wedding night, like that noble spectacle we explored, might involve proving your virginity with a bloodied sheet. No blood, you're in trouble, unless your family's got that vial of chicken blood handy. Men, meanwhile, faced no such scrutiny. Their purity was irrelevant. A double standard that makes you grit your teeth. Joke number 1. You thought modern dating profiles were judgmental? Try being a bride whose worth hinges on a single stain. Society policed women relentlessly. You're a young woman, and every step you take, every laugh, every unguarded moment is watched. A walk alone with a man could spark gossip. A late night chat by the fire could ruin you. You're remembering those brothel workers, shunned for their trade, and realizing virginity was a dividing line between good women and outcasts. Some women fought back, using their chastity strategically, like noble daughters who delayed marriage to gain influence. You're marveling at their nerve, knowing one slip could cost everything. There was a softer side, though. You're a mother, whispering to your daughter about protecting herself, not just for honor but for safety in a world that's quick to judge. These talks weren't just about rules, they were about survival, love, and hope for a secure future. Joke number 2. Forget awkward sex ed classes. Try explaining virginity to your kid while dodging questions about where babies actually come from. The pressure wasn't universal. You're hearing of widows or older women who sidestepped the virginity trap, their status giving them a bit more freedom. But for the young and unwed, the fixation was suffocating. You're watching that woman in the square, her chin up, and you feel a mix of admiration and pity. She's carrying a burden bigger than herself, a symbol of a society that prized purity over personhood. As you leave the square, the whispers fade, but the weight of that obsession lingers. Virginity wasn't just a state, it was a cage, a prize, a weapon. Joke number 3. You thought dodging spoilers online was tough? Try dodging a whole village betting on your wedding night bedsheet. You're stepping away, wondering how she bears it, and grateful you're only a visitor in a world that watched women so closely it forgot to see them. You're wandering through a bustling market, the air buzzing with the shouts of vendors hawking eggs and the sweet tang of crushed lavender. A wise woman's stall catches your eye, its table cluttered with vials of murky liquid and bundles of dried herbs tied with twine. She's whispering to a blushing young man about a special tonic to win his beloved's heart. And you're leaning in, curious about the medieval obsession with aphrodisiacs and love charms. In a world where desire was both celebrated and policed, people turned to potions, spells, and quirky rituals to spark passion or secure love. You're about to test the strange brews that promised to set hearts ablaze. Mainstream history tells us that medieval aphrodisiacs were rooted in a mix of folklore, medicine, and superstition, often tied to the humoral theories we laughed about. With that physician, you're being offered a paste of ground oysters and saffron, believed to heat the blood and stir desire. Because foods linked to warm humors were thought to boost libido, nobles might splurge on exotic spices, while peasants like you make do with local roots like mandrake, rumored to ignite passion but more likely to make you woozy. You're sniffing the concoction, wondering if it's love in a jar or just a fancy soup. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some believed wearing a charm made from a stag's heart could make you irresistible, especially if harvested under a full moon. You're picturing a lovesick villager trudging through the woods, dagger in hand, hoping Bambi's ticker will win over their crush. Historians still argue whether these charms were taken seriously or just a playful way to flirt. Either way, you're tucking a small pouch under your tunic, half hoping it works, half bracing for a night of indigestion. The church, as we've seen, wasn't thrilled about love potions, sniffing out hints of witchcraft in anything that meddled with free will. You're keeping this purchase quiet, knowing a nosy priest might accuse you of dabbling in the devil's work. Secular folks were more forgiving village wise women, and apothecaries thrived on selling these remedies, especially to desperate lovers or husbands worried about their performance. You're dodging the priest's gaze, clutching your vial like it's a winning lottery ticket. Joke number 1. You thought sneaking a Red Bull was sneaky? Try hiding a love potion from a cleric who smells sin in every sniffle. The ingredients were as wild as the claims. You're hearing about potions laced with ambergris, a whale byproduct that cost more than your yearly wages, or common herbs like vervain, thought to bind hearts if slipped into a beloved's ale. Some charms were outright bizarre, like tying a lock of your hair to a toad's leg to draw your lover closer. You're wincing, wondering who's got time to chase amphibians for romance. And don't forget the spells. A whispered chant over a candle could supposedly make someone pine for you, though you're skeptical it's just hot air. Gender shaped the game. If you're a woman, you're using these charms discreetly, maybe stirring a lust-inducing herb into your husband's stew to keep him faithful. Men, meanwhile, flaunt their potions, bragging about their virility like it's a jousting trophy. You're rolling your eyes at the double standard, but you're also curious, will that mandrake tonic make your crush swoon? Or just give you a rash? The risks were real. Some potions, like those with belladonna, could poison you faster than they sparked passion. You're sipping carefully, praying for love, not a trip to the healer. There was a playful side, too. You're at a village dance, watching couples slip each other trinkets, rings etched with hearts, or flowers tied with a charmed ribbon. These weren't always about seduction. Sometimes they were tokens of genuine affection, a nod to the courtship rituals we saw in that muddy village. Joke number 2. Forget sliding into DMs. Try sliding a charmed acorn into someone's pocket and hoping they don't scream. The human heart shone through. You're talking with your beloved, laughing over a shared vial of rose water that's supposed to make you inseparable. It's less about the potion and more about the hope it carries to people dreaming of a future in a hard world. Joke number 3. You thought a dating app algorithm was magic. Try betting your love life on a wise woman's brew and a prayer. As you leave the market, vial in hand, you're not sure if you believe in the charm, but you're smiling at the thought of trying, ready to see if love can be conjured from a pinch of herbs and a lot of heart. You're lying on a straw mattress in a cramped village hut, the fire's embers casting a soft glow as your spouse shifts beside you, muttering about tomorrow's chores. The air smells of wood smoke and damp wool, and you're both bone-tired from a day of hauling water and mending nets. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't just a bond of love or even a practical partnership. Like we saw in those village courtships, it was a duty, a contract where sex was less about passion and more about obligation. You're staring at the rafters, wondering if tonight's the night you pay the marital debt. Because in this world, saying not tonight could land you in trouble with both your spouse and the church. Mainstream history tells us that medieval marriage was a sacrament, governed by the church's ironclad rules. Sex within marriage wasn't optional. It was a mutual obligation called the marital debt, meaning you owed your spouse intimacy on demand, barring holy days or illness. Refusing could be grounds for annulment or a church court case, especially if your spouse complained. You're grumbling about a headache, but the priest's words echo. Denying your partner is a sin, almost as bad as adultery. You're rolling over, hoping a quick cuddle counts, because the church is watching, even here. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some couples used chastity belts as a joke or a test of fidelity when husbands went off to war, though they were rarer than pop culture suggests. You're chuckling at the idea of fumbling with a clunky lock, wondering if it's meant to keep your spouse faithful or just make them cranky. Historians still argue whether these devices were practical tools or exaggerated symbols of control. Either way, you're glad your marriage relies on trust, not iron contraptions. Though the pressure to perform feels like its own kind of cage. The church, as we've seen, had a stranglehold on your bedroom. Sex was for making babies, not chasing thrills. And you're supposed to keep it functional, no fancy moves, no excessive enjoyment. But you're human. And sometimes you catch your spouse's eye, and there's a spark that defies the sermons. The catch: if you're too passionate, you're sinning by loving immoderately. You're stifling a laugh, wondering who's got time to measure their ardor when there's a cow to milk at dawn. Joke number 1. You thought arguing over dishes was a mood killer. Try debating whether your cuddle's too sinful for St. Peter's liking. Gender roles shaped this duty. If you're a wife, your job is to provide heirs and keep the household running. Sex is part of the deal. Like churning butter. Men, meanwhile, are expected to lead. And refusing the debt could dent their authority. You're a husband, feeling the weight of proving your virility, especially if the village is whispering about your childless home. The pressure's relentless, and you're remembering those noble wedding nights, where performance was a public spectacle. At least here, it's just you, your spouse, and the nosy neighbor who probably hears everything through the thin walls. The practical side was stark. You're not just sharing a bed for warmth, like we saw in that crowded hovel. You're building a family to survive. A child means more hands for the harvest, but it also means another mouth to feed. You're weighing the risks, maybe recalling that wise woman's contraceptive brew. But the church says procreation is non-negotiable. Some couples dodged the debt during forbidden times, like Lent, to space their children. But you're careful not to admit it. Confession's a minefield, and priests love prying. There were moments of tenderness, though. You're stealing a quiet laugh with your spouse, reminiscing about that awkward courtship by the well. Duty doesn't erase affection, it just weaves it into the grind. You're brushing their hair from their face, and for a second, the church's rules feel far away. Joke number 2. Forget Netflix binges as bonding. Try bonding over who snores louder on this lumpy mattress. The flip side was grim. You're hearing tales of couples dragged to court, one accusing the other of shirking the debt, turning private struggles into public shame. Impotence or infertility could unravel a marriage, with fingers pointed at curses or sin. You're grateful your marriage is steady, but you feel for those caught in the church's web, where love is a contract, and failure is a scandal. As you pull the blanket tighter, the weight of duty settles. You're not just a lover or a partner, you're a cog in a system that demands your body, your loyalty, and your soul. Joke number 3. You thought dodging a work deadline was stressful? Try dodging a divine mandate while your spouse gives you the side eye. Marriage is your anchor, but it's also your chain. And tonight, you're just hoping for a moment of warmth before the world demands its due again. You're elbow deep in a raucous village fair, the air thick with the smell of roasted chestnuts and spilled ale, as fiddles wail and laughter bounces off the thatched roofs. It's a rare break from the grind, and the whole village is here. Peasants, peddlers, even the grumpy miller dancing, flirting, and forgetting the church's watchful eye for a night. These festivals were the medieval equivalent of a pop-up party, where sparks of romance flew faster than the juggler's pins. You're weaving through the crowd, catching stolen glances and bold winks, ready to see how love and lust bloomed when the rules loosened and the mead flowed. Mainstream history tells us that medieval festivals, like May Day or harvest feasts, were prime time for courtship and flirtation, especially among peasants. You're watching young men and women pair off during dances, their hands brushing in a reel that's just a little too close for the priest's liking. These events were sanctioned spaces for mixing, where the church's strict bedroom rules, like those we saw in that sermon-heavy church, took a back seat to community revelry. You're joining a circle dance, hoping to catch the eye of that baker's apprentice with the lopsided grin. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some festivals featured love games, like mock weddings or races where the winner got a kiss from their chosen partner. You're cheering as a lad sprints past, aiming to smooch the blacksmith's daughter, only to trip over a stray goose. Historians still argue whether these games were harmless fun or a sneaky way to test romantic chemistry before parents started haggling over dowries. Either way, you're dodging feathers and plotting your own move, maybe slipping a wildflower into someone's hair. The church, as we've seen, wasn't thrilled about unchecked passion, but festivals were a gray zone. You're sneaking a giggle with your crush behind a hay bale, knowing the priest is too busy blessing the ale barrels to notice. These moments were fleeting rebellions against the marital duty and sin-obsessed sermons we've explored. The community played along, elders might scold, but they'd also wink, remembering their own festival flings. You're bold tonight, but you're keeping one eye on the crowd, because gossip, as we saw in those village courtships, spreads faster than wildfire. The setting fueled the fire. You're surrounded by bonfires, ribbon-decked maypoles, and tables groaning with bread and cider. The chaos gave cover for flirtations that'd be scandalous on a regular Tuesday. You're sharing a tankard with someone special, your knees brushing under the table, and the warmth in your chest isn't just from the drink. Joke number 1. You thought a crowded bar was a pickup spot. Try wooing someone while dodging a drunken juggler and a nosy aunt. Gender roles bent slightly here. If you're a woman, you're freer to laugh loudly or tease a suitor without being branded forward. Festivals were for letting loose. Men, meanwhile, showed off with feats of strength, like wrestling or tossing hay bales, hoping to impress. You're watching a cocky lad flex for the crowd, only to slip in the mud and earn a roar of laughter. The playing field wasn't equal. Women still faced harsher judgment for going too far. But for one night, you're all just revelers chasing a spark. The risks were real, though. You're hearing whispers of a girl who got too cozy last feast, and now faces a shotgun betrothal or a scolding from the priest we met in that sin-obsessed church. A stolen kiss could lead to a forced marriage or a fine if the wrong person saw. You're keeping your flirtations subtle, maybe offering a ribbon as a token, like those love charms we saw at the market. But the thrill of possibility outweighs the fear. At least while the music's playing, there was a tender side, too. You're sitting by the fire as the night winds down, sharing a quiet moment with your festival sweetheart. It's not all body chaos. Some couples forge real bonds here, their laughter laying the groundwork for a life together, like those practical village marriages. Joke number 2. Forget swiping right. Try sealing the deal with a shared pie crust in a clumsy dance. As the fiddles fade, you're left with a glow that's half ale, half hope. Festivals were where hearts raced and rules bent. A brief escape from the grind of survival and the church's glare. Joke number 3. You thought a night out was wild. Try falling for someone while a goat steals your bread and the priest's counting sins. You're heading home, a flower tucked in your belt, carrying the memory of a night when love felt free. Even if the morning brings the world's weight back, you're strolling through a sun-dappled castle courtyard, the clink of armor and the strum of a lute drifting on the breeze, as a dashing knight kneels before a lady, pledging his undying devotion in flowery verse. This is the world of courtly love, a medieval ideal where knights worship noble women with poetic sighs and heroic deeds, all while keeping their passion chaste, at least in theory. You're watching this performance, half swooning, half skeptical, because behind the Romance lies a tangled web of lust, power, and pretense. Courtly love wasn't just a game. It was a mask for desires that could burn hotter than a tournament's bonfire. Mainstream history tells us that courtly love, popularized in 12th century courts like that of Eleanor of Aquitaine, was a cultural phenomenon, blending chivalry with idealized romance. You're a knight, swearing loyalty to a lady who's often married to someone else, like your lord. Your love is supposed to be spiritual admiration from afar, expressed through songs or quests, not sweaty trysts. But let's be real, you're human, and those longing glances at the banquet table, like the ones we saw in those noble affairs, hint at something less pure. The church, as always, approved only if it stayed platonic. But you're betting plenty of knights hoped for more. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some knights wore their lady's token, like a sleeve or scarf, into battle, claiming it gave them strength though. It probably doubled as a flex to impress her husband's rivals. You're tying a ribbon to your lance, hoping it doesn't get caught in your armor mid-joust. Historians still argue whether courtly love was a genuine romantic ideal, or a fancy excuse for flirting with someone else's spouse. Either way, you're reciting poetry, praying your lady doesn't laugh at your shaky rhymes. The church, as we've seen, had a love-hate relationship with passion. Courtly love was fine if it lifted the soul toward God. But if it veered into adultery like that stable rendezvous we witnessed, it was a sin. You're treading a fine line, praising your lady's virtue in public while dreaming of her in private. The court ate it up. These displays were entertainment, a way to flaunt status. You're performing for an audience of nobles, each one judging your devotion like it's a medieval reality show. Joke number 1. You thought posting a thirst trap was bold? Try serenading a duchess while her husband sharpens his sword. Gender dynamics were key. If you're a lady, you're the untouchable muse, wielding power by granting or withholding favor. A smile could send a knight on a crusade. A frown could ruin his reputation. You're savoring the control, but you're also trapped step 2. Far, and you're the adulteress we met in that scandalous affair. Knights, meanwhile, used courtly love to climb the social ladder, their devotion a ticket to patronage or prestige. You're a knight, and your lady's favor might mean a better horse or a rival's envy. But you're also risking her husband's wrath. The reality was messier than the ballads. You're hearing whispers of knights and ladies who took courtly love too far, their chaste devotion landing them in bed or in trouble. Think of Lancelot and Guinevere, whose legendary love sparked chaos. You're dodging rumors, knowing one misstep could turn your poetic fling into a political disaster. Like those royal bedchamber intrigues, the line between admiration and obsession was thin, and you're walking it with a pounding heart. There was a romantic side, though. You're penning a letter to your lady, pouring out your heart in ink. And for a moment, it's not about politics or sin, it's about connection. These ideals, however staged, gave people a language for longing. In a world that often crushed it, you're remembering those festival flirtations, where peasants seized joy. Here, nobles did the same, just with fancier props. Joke number 2. Forget sliding into DMs with a heart emoji. Try sending a sonnet by messenger pigeon and hoping it doesn't get lost. The catch? It was all a performance. You're playing a role, and the court's watching, ready to cheer or jeer. Your lady's married, your vows are public, and the church is lurking. You're channeling your desire into a joust, hoping to win her smile. But you know it's a fantasy that could crumble if you push too far. Joke number 3. You thought a situationship was complicated. Try loving someone you can't touch. while her husband's got a castle and a grudge. As you ride off, ribbon fluttering, you're caught between the thrill of the game and the ache of a love that's meant to stay just out of reach. You're slipping through the bustling halls of a noble household, past clattering kitchens and gossiping servants, catching the soft laughter of women weaving in a sunlit chamber. In the Middle Ages, women's desires were rarely discussed, their voices drowned out by the church's sermons and men's rules. But here, in stolen moments over spinning wheels, in quiet gardens, or behind the veil of a marriage bed, you're uncovering how women navigated their sexual agency in a world that tried to lock it away. You're listening closely because their stories, like those whispered same-sex desires, were fierce, clever, and often hidden in plain sight. Mainstream history tells us that medieval women, especially peasants and nobles, were bound by strict gender roles, their sexuality tied to marriage and motherhood. As we saw in those village huts and royal bedchambers, you're a woman, and your body's not your own. It belongs to your husband, your family, or the church, which preached chastity or procreation over pleasure. Yet, women found ways to assert their desires, whether through subtle rebellion or bold risks. You're marveling at their grit, knowing every move was a gamble against a society that prized virginity and obedience. Like that young woman in the village square. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some women used love magic, like slipping a charmed herb into a man's ale, to sway his affection or keep him faithful. A trick we glimpsed at that wise woman's stall. You're chuckling at the thought of a wife stirring parsley into stew with a wink, hoping it'll keep her husband's eyes from wandering. Historians still argue whether these acts were about control or just playful superstition, but you're betting it felt empowering to nudge fate, even if the church called it witchcraft. The church, as we've seen, was a constant shadow, labeling women as temptresses who sparked men's sins. You're dodging sermons that blame you for every lustful glance, yet you're also learning to wield that power. If you're a noble woman, like those in courtly love dramas, you're using charm to influence knights or lords, turning desire into a tool for status or safety. If you're a peasant, you're flirting at festivals, like that raucous fair, knowing a well-timed smile could secure a better match. But the risks are steep. One misstep, and you're facing the adultery, scandals, or brothel stigmas we've witnessed. Agency often hid in the margins. You're a widow, and unlike that scrutinized virgin, you've got wiggle room. You can remarry, manage land, or even choose celibacy, dodging the marital debt we explored. Some widows took lovers discreetly, their experience giving them leverage. Younger women lacked. You're hearing tales of women in convents, where vows of chastity didn't always stop secret passions, as those same-sex shadows hinted. You're in awe of their boldness, knowing discovery could mean ruin. Marriage was a battleground. You're a wife, and while the church demands you pay the debt, you're also negotiating your own needs, maybe feigning illness to avoid an unwanted night, or coaxing your husband with affection to strengthen your bond. Some women, as we saw with those contraceptive brews, risked sin to control family size. A quiet act of defiance. You're whispering with friends, sharing tricks to spark desire or dodge it, building a network of wisdom the church couldn't touch. Joke number 1. You thought girl talk was spicy now? Try swapping bedroom tips while the priest's preaching hellfire next door. The stakes were higher for women. You're facing double standards. Men could flaunt affairs like those noble liaisons, but your slip could brand you a harlot. Yet, you're finding power in subtlety, using wit, beauty, or even silence to shape your path. Think of figures like Christine de Pizan, who wrote of women's strength, or those cunning noble women who turned scandals into leverage. You're learning to play the game, but it's exhausting, and one wrong move could cost you everything. There was tenderness, too. You're stealing a moment with your lover or husband, your laughter soft in the dark. And it's not just duty, it's connection, a spark that feels like yours alone. These moments, like those festival flings, were lifelines. Joke number 2. Forget candlelit dates. Try stealing a kiss while the kids, the goat, and the in-laws snore nearby. As you leave the weaving chamber, the women's voices linger. They weren't just pawns, they were players, carving out desire in a world that tried to cage it. Joke number 3. You thought dodging a bad date was tricky. Try dodging the church, your husband, and the village gossip while chasing your heart. You're carrying their secrets, a testament to their strength, and you're grateful for a glimpse into desires that burned bright, even in the shadows. You're trudging through a muddy village lane, the air sharp with the tang of wood smoke and the distant clang of a smithy. As you catch sight of a young man hauling a sack of grain, his shoulders squared under the weight of more than just barley. In the Middle Ages, men's bedroom expectations were a tangle of pride, pressure, and unwritten rules, shaped by a society that tied masculinity to strength, virility, and control. You're watching him nod to a group of lads, their laughter edged with bravado, and you're about to dive into what it meant to be a man in a world where your worth was measured by your airs, your honor, and your ability to keep desire in check, or at least look like you did. Mainstream history tells us that medieval masculinity was rooted in providing and protecting. Whether you were a peasant plowing fields or a noble leading men to war, you're a man, and your role in the bedroom, like that marital duty we explored, is clear. Produce children, prove your potency, and uphold the family name. Impotence or infertility, as we saw with those royal bedchamber anxieties, wasn't just a personal failure, it was a public crisis that could cost you respect or even your marriage. You're feeling the weight of every village gossip, wondering if your lack of a son yet is already fodder for the alehouse. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some men wore amulets made of wolf teeth, believed to boost their manly vigor, especially if blessed by a local healer. You're fingering a jagged tooth on a cord, half laughing at the idea that a wolf's bite could solve your bedroom woes. Historians still argue whether these charms were about confidence or just desperate superstition, but you're hoping it at least impresses your wife, even if it smells faintly of the forest floor. The church, as we've seen, loomed large, preaching that sex was for procreation, not pleasure, and men were expected to lead with restraint. You're dodging sermons about lust, like those sin-obsessed rants we heard, but the pressure to perform is relentless. If you're too eager, you're a lecher. If you're too reserved, you're weak. You're navigating a tightrope, trying to satisfy your spouse's marital debt without earning a priest's side-eye. Joke number 1. You thought mansplaining was a modern problem? Try explaining to a priest why you skipped a holy day for a roll in the hay. Society's expectations were brutal. You're a peasant, and your virility is proof you can build a family to work the land, like those practical village marriages. If you're a noble, your heirs secure alliances, as we saw in those dynastic bedchambers. Failure to deliver, like a childless marriage, could spark rumors of curses or cuckoldry, and you're wincing at the thought of ballads mocking your barren bed. Men bragged about conquests, as we glimpsed in those noble affairs, but you're keeping quiet, knowing one boast could invite a rival's challenge or a wife's wrath. The double standard helped. You're allowed more leeway than women, whose virginity and fidelity As we saw in that village square, we're under constant scrutiny. A fling might earn you a slap or a fine, but it won't ruin you like it would a woman caught in adultery. Still, you're not free. You're dodging the church's rules and your community's eyes. You're remembering those brothel visits, where men sought escape. But even there, you're judged if you're to frequent a guest. You're striving for balance. But it's like juggling torches in a windstorm. There was vulnerability, too. You're talking with your wife, admitting fears about another lean year or a childless future. And these moments, like those quiet hut conversations, build trust. You're not just a provider, you're a partner, and the bedroom is where you prove it, not just with airs but with care. You're recalling those festival flirtations, where men showed off to win hearts. Here, you're showing up in private, hoping your efforts matter. Joke number 2. Forget flexing at the gym. Try flexing your patience when the kids and the goats interrupt your big night. The pressure could break you. You're hearing tales of men shamed in church courts for failing to satisfy their wives. Their manhood dissected by sneering neighbors. Some turned to potions, like those aphrodisiacs we saw, or even prayer, hoping St. John would fix what nature didn't. You're carrying that wolf tooth, but you're also carrying doubt, wondering if you'll measure up to a world that demands so much. As you sling that grain sack over your shoulder, the village's eyes linger. You're not just a man, you're a symbol of strength, expected to conquer fields and bed alike. Joke number 3. You thought a bad Tinder bio was embarrassing? Try living down a rumor that your spear missed its mark. You're stepping forward, determined to prove yourself, but grateful for the moments when your wife's smile says you're enough. No amulet required. You're crouched by a flickering hearth in a peasant's hut, the air thick with the scent of stew, and the muffled cries of a woman in labor, echoing from a curtained corner. Outside, a midwife hurries through the dusk, her basket brimming with herbs and charms. In the Middle Ages, sex and childbirth were inseparable, each act of intimacy shadowed by the dangers of bringing new life. You're watching the village rally, neighbors whispering prayers, men pacing nervously because every birth was a gamble, and you're about to see how deeply sex tied to the perilous hope of motherhood. In a world where survival hung by a thread, mainstream history tells us that childbirth was a leading cause of death for medieval women, with estimates suggesting up to 20% of mothers died from complications like infection or hemorrhage. You're a woman, and every time you lie with your husband, like those dutiful nights in the marriage bed, you're rolling the dice on a pregnancy that could be your last. The church, as we've seen, insisted sex was for procreation, but you're all too aware of the cost, each child a blessing, but also a risk that could leave your family motherless. You're clutching a charm, hoping it'll ease what's coming. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some midwives used a birthing girdle, a parchment inscribed with prayers, tied around a laboring woman's waist to ward off evil spirits and speed delivery. You're imagining the midwife knotting it tightly, muttering psalms while you grit your teeth through another contraction. Historians still argue whether these rituals were about faith, or just a way to calm terrified mothers. Either way, you're praying that scrap of paper works better than the wise woman's contraceptive brew we tried. Earlier, the church's shadow loomed large. You're supposed to accept childbirth's pain as Eve's curse, a divine punishment for original sin, refusing sex to avoid pregnancy, as we saw with the marital debt, was sinful. But so was using those dubious contraceptives. You're caught in a trap, damned if you do, damned if you don't. Midwives, often women of dubious repute in the church's eyes, walked a fine line. Their skills saved lives, but a failed birth could spark accusations of witchcraft. You're grateful for the midwife's steady hands, but you're also whispering extra prayers just in case. The process was grueling. You're laboring in a dim room, surrounded by women your mother, sisters, neighbors offering broth and encouragement. There's no doctor here, male physicians, like that quack with his humoral theories, rarely attended births. The bed is straw. The tools are basic: a knife, some cloths, maybe a basin if you're lucky. Complications like breech births or prolonged labor could be fatal, and you're fighting fear as much as pain, knowing stories of women who didn't make it. Like those whispered in the weaving chamber, men were outsiders here. You're a husband, pacing outside, barred from the birthing room by custom. Your role was to plant the seed, as those masculine expectations demanded, but now you're helpless, praying for a son to carry your name or a daughter to seal an alliance. You're remembering those noble wedding nights, where heirs were the prize. Here, it's no less urgent, just humbler. A stillbirth or a mother's death could shatter a family's future, and you're feeling the weight of that possibility. There was community, though. You're seeing neighbors drop off bread or a jug of ale, their faces tight with hope. Birth was a village affair, tying sex to survival in a way that went beyond the couple. A new child meant more hands for the harvest, as we saw in those practical marriages, but also more mouths to feed. You're holding your breath, knowing this birth could shift the balance of your world. Joke number 1. You thought baby showers were stressful? Try waiting for a birth when the whole village bets on whether it's a boy or a goat. The aftermath was fragile. You're a mother, exhausted but alive, cradling a squalling baby while the midwife cleans up. Survival feels like a miracle, but you're already dreading the next pregnancy. Some women, as we saw with those contraceptive risks, tried to space births, but the church's rules made it a dangerous game. You're whispering thanks to every saint you know, hoping this child grows strong. Joke number 2. Forget postpartum yoga. Try recovering while the cow needs milking and the priest's eyeing your soul. As the heart's glow fades, you're struck by the raw link between sex and survival. Every embrace carried this shadow, a reminder that love could lead to loss. Joke number 3. You thought a bad date was high stakes. Try a night of passion that ends with a midwife, a prayer, and a village holding its breath. You're stepping back, the cries of new life echoing, carrying the weight of a world where desire and danger were forever entwined. You're tiptoeing through the stone corridors of a medieval monastery, the air heavy with the scent of wax and old parchment, as candlelight flickers on walls etched with saints. The silence is thick, broken only by the soft chant of monks at prayer, but you're catching whispers of something else: furtive glances, a hand lingering too long on a brother's shoulder. In the Middle Ages, monasteries were havens of celibacy, but they were also human, and desire didn't always bow to vows. You're peeking into a world where monastic life clashed with temptation, and the battle between soul and body was as fierce as any crusade. Mainstream history tells us that monasteries were designed to isolate monks from worldly sins, including sex, with vows of chastity enforced by strict rules and the church's ever-watchful eye. You're a young monk, tonsured and robed, sworn to a life of prayer, but you're also flesh and blood, surrounded by men in close quarters, shared dormitories, long nights, and endless hours of solitude that invite wandering thoughts. The church, as we saw in those sin-obsessed sermons, branded any lapse as a grave offense, especially sodomy, a term we encountered in those same-sex shadows. You're keeping your eyes on your psalter, but your heart's racing, and you're not alone. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some monasteries used custodes, older monks assigned to watch younger ones, supposedly to prevent impure behavior during late-night hours. You're stifling a laugh, imagining Brother Anselm, half asleep, snoring through his watchdog duties while you sneak a forbidden chat by the scriptorium. Historians still argue whether these measures curbed temptation or just made monks sneakier. Either way, you're dodging the custodes, hoping your quick smile doesn't betray the warmth you feel for a certain scribe. The church's rules were relentless. Celibacy wasn't just a promise, it was a war against nature. You're wrestling with thoughts that creep in during Vespers, memories of a festival flirtation before you took your vows, or maybe a new affection for a brother who shares your love of illuminated manuscripts. Confession, as we saw, was a trap. Admitting unnatural desires could mean penance, expulsion, or worse, a public shaming like those adulterers faced. You're mumbling vague sins to the abbot, praying he doesn't press for details. Joke number 1. You thought dodging a boss's email was tricky? Try dodging a confessor who thinks your soul's a ledger of lust. Temptation wasn't always same sex. You're hearing tales of monks sneaking to nearby villages, meeting women in secret, like those brothel clients we met, or even seducing nuns from a neighboring convent. These scandals, when uncovered, rocked the church. Think of the 11th century reforms targeting concubinage among clergy. You're shocked but not surprised. The monastery's walls can't block human nature, and the vow of chastity feels heavier with every passing season. Women in convents faced similar struggles, their desires often cloaked in spiritual poetry. As we glimpsed in those women's hidden passions, the monastery itself was a pressure cooker. You're living cheek by jowl with others, sharing meals, prayers, and even beds in some smaller houses. Friendships could deepen into something more. And while some bonds stayed platonic, others crossed lines. You're recalling those same-sex love poems, their coded longing echoing in the glances you've seen. The church called it sin, but you're wondering if love, even forbidden, can truly be wrong when it feels so human. Punishments were harsh. You're hearing of monks flogged or confined to bread and water for indecent acts, their names whispered as warnings. Yet, leniency existed. Some abbots, perhaps remembering their own youth, turned a blind eye unless the scandal went public. You're grateful for your abbot's soft spot, but you're still careful, knowing one jealous brother could betray you. Joke number 2. Forget office snitchies. Try keeping a secret when your rivals got a quill and a grudge. There was beauty, too. You're sharing a quiet moment, helping a brother bind a book, your hands brushing over vellum. And it's not just desire, it's connection, a spark in a life of discipline. These moments, like those women's weaving room laughs, were lifelines. You're holding onto them, even as the church demands your heart stay cold. Joke number 3. You thought sneaking a coffee break was rebellious? Try sneaking a smile when the abbot's chanting about hellfire as you slip back to your cell. The monastery's silence feels heavier. You're carrying a secret, one that could damn or save you, depending on who's judging. The vows are iron, but your heart's not stone. And in this cloistered world, temptation isn't just a sin, it's a reminder you're still alive, still human, still yearning for something beyond the Psalms. You're elbowing your way through a smoky tavern, the air thick with the tang of sour ale, and the roar of laughter. Zero laughter, as a bard in a patched cloak strums a lute and spins a tale of a night, a lady, and a very compromising hayloft. The crowd hoots and jeers, tossing coppers or crusts of bread, and you're grinning at the body punchline that's definitely not church approved. In the Middle Ages, sexual humor was a release valve, a way to poke fun at the church's stern rules. and the bedroom dramas we've been exploring. You're leaning in, ready to unpack the raunchy jokes and ribald tales that kept medieval folk chuckling, even when the priest was scowling. Mainstream history tells us that humor, especially the bawdy kind, was a staple of medieval life, from peasant taverns to noble feasts. You're hearing echoes of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, where pilgrims swap stories of cuckolded husbands and sly lovers, or Fablio Short, spicy tales of bedroom misadventures. These weren't just for laughs. They were a middle finger to the church's sin-obsessed sermons. We heard in that fire and brimstone church. You're raising your tankard, loving how a well-timed jest about a monk's vow of chastity can make even the grumpiest farmer snort ale. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some festivals, like the Feast of Fools, turn the world upside down with mock sermons where bishops preached about the virtues of gluttony or lust. You're picturing a drunken cleric in a donkey costume, slurring a hymn to Venus while the crowd roars. Historians still argue whether these events were harmless satire or a dangerous jab at authority. Either way, you're wishing you'd been there, dodging the real bishop's glare while cheering the fake one's ode to a barmaid's charms. The church, as we've seen, wasn't amused. Jokes about sex, like those mocking monastic temptations we explored, were seen as gateways to sin, tempting listeners to stray from the narrow path. You're whispering a particularly naughty riddle about a rooster and a hen, keeping it low, so the local priest, nursing his ale in the corner, doesn't overhear. But the tavern's a safe haven here. Humor trumps piety, and you're reveling in the defiance. A nod to those festival flirtations where rules bent. Joke number 1. You thought a spicy meme was bold. Try cracking a nun joke when the abbots got a temper and a whip. The humor wasn't just crude, it was clever. You're catching a pun about a knight's lance that's so layered it takes a second to land, earning groans and grins. These jokes often skewered the powerful lords, like those in Our Noble Affairs, were mocked for their bedroom flops, while priests got roasted for preaching chastity while eyeing the miller's wife. You're loving the egalitarianism. In the tavern, a peasant's wit could outshine a lord's title. It's a far cry from the virginity obsession we saw in that village square, where women bore the brunt of scrutiny. Gender shaped the laughs. Men's jokes, often about conquests or cuckoldry, reinforced the virility we explored in those masculine expectations. Women's humor, though less recorded, could be biting. Think of a wife jesting about her husband's short sword to her sewing circle. You're imagining those women in the weaving chamber, giggling over a quip that'd make the priest blush. But women had to be careful. A too bold joke could land them in the same hot water as an adulteress. You're admiring their nerve, knowing the stakes. The humor had a dark edge. You're hearing a tale about a lover caught in a wardrobe, played for laughs, but it reminds you of those deadly adultery stakes. Jokes about infidelity or impotence danced close to real fears: barrenness, shame, or exile. Yet, the laughter was cathartic, a way to face the grim realities of childbirth dangers or marital duties we've covered. You're toasting the bard, grateful for a moment to laugh at life's absurdities. Joke number 2. Forget viral TikToks. A good fabliau about a randy squire could keep a village buzzing for weeks. There was heart, too. You're sharing a chuckle with a stranger over a story of two lovers outwitting a jealous husband. And it's not just the punchline, it's the shared humanity. Like those quiet hut moments, humor built bonds, knitting communities through shared defiance. You're feeling the warmth, a reminder that even in a hard world, laughter was a spark of rebellion and joy. As the bard bows, you toss a coin, the tavern's din fading. These Jokes were more than entertainment, they were survival. A way to thumb your nose at fate, the church, and the bedroom's burdens. Joke number 3. You thought stand-up comedy was raw? Try a medieval jest about a monk's holy staff. When the wrong ear's listening, you're stepping into the night, still chuckling, carrying the spirit of a people who laughed to live. You're standing in the dusty square of a medieval town, the air sharp with the tang of fresh bread and the distant toll of a church bell, as a stern-faced bailiff reads from a parchment, listing punishments for lewd conduct and carnal misdeeds. Around you, villagers whisper, some smirking, others pale, because the laws of the bedroom weren't just church sermons, they were hard rules, enforced by courts, fines, and public shame. In the Middle Ages, your intimate life was everyone's business, from the priest to the local lord. And you're about to untangle the legal codes that govern desire, making every kiss or caress a potential crime. You're keeping your head down, hoping your own secrets stay buried. Mainstream history tells us that medieval Europe had a dual legal system for sexual behavior. Ecclesiastical courts, run by the church, and secular courts, overseen by lords or town officials. You're caught in their crosshairs, whether it's for sneaking a tryst like those festival flirtations or dodging the marital debt. We explored in that village hut. The church, as we've seen, policed sins like adultery or fornication, slapping you with penance or excommunication, while secular laws hit your wallet or your pride fines, whippings, or a stint in the stocks for stepping out of line. You're eyeing the stocks in the square, praying your name's not next on the bailiff's list. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some towns used scolding bridles, iron masks to silence women accused of wanton behavior, like flirting too, openly or spreading bedroom gossip. You're wincing at the thought of that cold metal, wondering if it's worse than the public shaming we saw with those brothel workers. Historians still argue whether these punishments were about control or just crowd-pleasing spectacles to keep the peace. Either way, you're biting your tongue, knowing one saucy comment could land you in more than just hot water. The church's laws were rooted in scripture, as we saw in those sin-obsessed sermons, targeting anything outside procreative marriage. You're a villager caught kissing your betrothed before the wedding, and now you're facing a fine or a humiliating church penance. Think, standing in a white sheet during mass, like those adulterers we met. Secular courts, meanwhile, cared more about property and order. If you're a noblewoman, like that scandalous lover in the stable, your affair could cost your family land or alliances. If you're a peasant, your fling might mean a tax to the lord for dishonoring the village. You're cursing the system, wishing love wasn't a legal minefield. Gender tipped the scales. You're a woman, and your virtue, as we saw in that virginity-obsessed square, is under constant scrutiny. Step out of line, and you're fined, shamed, or worse, branded a harlot. Men got lighter punishments. A man's affair, like those noble liaisons, might cost a few coins, but a woman's could cost her freedom. You're fuming at the unfairness, recalling how men's bedroom expectations allowed swagger while women tiptoed. Some women, though, used the courts cleverly, accusing unfaithful husbands to win sympathy or alimony. You're cheering their nerve, even if it's a rare win. The laws weren't just about punishment, they shaped behavior. You're avoiding late-night walks with your sweetheart, knowing a nosy neighbor could report you for suspicious conduct, like those same-sex whispers we overheard. Courts relied on snitchies, and villages thrived on gossip, as we saw in those practical courtships. You're keeping your romance discreet, maybe slipping a love token like those courtly knights. But even that's risky if the wrong eyes spot it. Joke number 1. You thought dodging a speeding ticket was stressful? Try dodging a fine for holding hands after curfew. There were loopholes. You're hearing of couples who pre-contracted marriages in secret, claiming their tryst was just an early wedding night to dodge fornication charges. Others paid off officials or leaned on powerful kin, like those royal bedchamber schemers, to hush up scandals. You're marveling at the hustle, but you're also wary just as often favored the rich or connected, leaving peasants like you to face the stocks. There was humanity, too. You're watching a young couple, fined for a premarital slip, now married, and laughing it off. Their bond stronger for it. These laws were harsh, but they couldn't kill love or lust, as we saw in those weaving room whispers. You're feeling a spark of defiance, knowing people found ways to steal joy despite the rules. Joke number 2. Forget sneaking past a bouncer. Try sneaking a kiss when the bailiff's got a ledger, and a grudge as the bailiff rolls up his parchment. You slip away, the square's tension lingering. The laws were a net, catching desire in its threads, but they couldn't trap the heart. Joke number 3. You thought a bad Yelp review was harsh? Try a court ruling that your love life's a public offense. You're stepping lightly, grateful. You're slipping through a bustling castle hall, the air rich with the scent of roasted boar and the clink of goblets, as a nobleman's son steals a glance at a peasant girl serving ale, her quick smile sparking something dangerous. In the Middle Ages, love across class lines was a forbidden thrill, a collision of desire and defiance that could upend families, fortunes, and social order. You're watching their eyes meet, a fleeting moment that echoes the noble affairs and village flirtations we've seen. But this is riskier a romance that defies the rigid hierarchy of a world where status was everything. You're holding your breath, knowing this liaison could ignite a firestorm. Mainstream history tells us that medieval society was stratified, with nobles, clergy, and peasants locked into roles that rarely mixed, especially in matters of the heart. You're a noble, and marrying or even dallying below your station could cost you land, titles, or your family's favor, as we saw in those dynastic bedchamber politics. For a peasant, the stakes were just as high. A fling with a lord could bring fleeting wealth but also ruin, shame, or worse. A one-way trip to the stocks we glimpsed in that legal square. You're whispering sweet nothings, but every word's a gamble, and the court's gossip is sharper than a dagger. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some cross-glass lovers used secret betrothals, swearing vows in private to claim their love was legitimate if caught. A trick we saw with those legal loopholes. You're imagining the couple clasping hands by moonlight, hoping a whispered promise outwits the Lord's wrath. Historians still argue whether these vows were romantic rebellion or desperate bids to dodge punishment. Either way, you're tucking a ribbon from her hair into your sleeve, praying it's a keepsake, not evidence. The church, as we've seen, had a chokehold on love, insisting marriages serve God and society, not passion. A noble peasant union was frowned upon, disrupting the divine order where lords ruled and peasants toiled. You're dodging the priest's sermons, like those sin-obsessed rants, knowing he'd call your fling a scandal. Secular powers were no kinder. Your noble father might disinherit you, while her peasant kin could face the Lord's retribution for tainting his bloodline. You're stealing moments in the stables, like that adulterous tryst, but the stakes feel heavier when class divides you. Joke number 1. You thought a workplace crush was taboo? Try wooing across a class gap when your dad's got a castle and hers has a plow. The consequences were brutal. If you're the noble, your family might lock you in a tower or ship you to a monastery. like those wayward monks we met. If you're the peasant girl, you're risking accusations of bewitching your lover, a charge that could land you in a witch trial's shadow. You're recalling those brothel workers, scorned for their trade, and realizing a peasant woman's honor was fragile, especially when a lord's involved. Some stories ended in tragedy. Think of real-life cases like Edward IV's mistress Jane Shore, whose low birth made her a target when the affair soured, yet some defied the odds. You're hearing whispers of nobles who married down, like a knight wed to a merchant's daughter, their love softening the scandal over time. These were rare, but they happened, especially in towns where trade blurred class lines. You're cheering for the couple, but you're also wary society forgave slowly, and the noble's kin often made life hell. For peasants, a noble lover might offer a fleeting escape from poverty, but it came with strings. Like those mistress arrangements we saw in royal courts, there was tenderness, too. You're watching them share a stolen moment by the kitchen fire, her laughter soft, his hand brushing hers. It's not just lust, like those courtly love games. It's a connection that defies the world's rules, echoing the weaving room bonds of women's desires. You're feeling their hope, a spark that burns brighter because it's forbidden. Joke number 2. Forget sneaking past a bouncer. Try sneaking a kiss when the Lord's steward's counting every servant's step. The reality was harsh. You're seeing the nobleman's father storm in, his face thunderous. And you know this romance is doomed to broken betrothal, a banished girl, or worse. The class divide, like the church's laws or virginity's weight, was a wall few could scale. You're carrying their story, a reminder that love could be a rebellion. But rebellion came at a cost. Joke number 3. You thought a long-distance relationship was tough? Try loving someone when the whole feudal system's got a grudge. As you slip away, their glance lingers, a fleeting dream in a world that demanded duty over desire. You're trudging through a frost-kissed field, the air biting your cheeks as the sun dips low, painting the sky in hues of amber and gray. It's late autumn, and the village is bustling with preparations for winter, stacking firewood, salting meat, and praying the harvest holds. In the Middle Ages, the seasons didn't just shape crops. They dictated the rhythm of intimacy, weaving sex into the cycle of survival. You're watching couples steal glances by the bonfire or huddle closer in their huts. And you're about to explore how the turning year influenced love and lust, from spring's fever to winter's chill. In a world where nature set the tempo for desire, in mainstream history tells us that medieval life was tied to the agricultural calendar, with seasons shaping work, food, and even family planning. As we saw with those practical village marriages, you're a peasant, and spring and summer were prime for romance. Long days, warm nights, and festivals like that raucous fair meant more chances to flirt or steal a moment in the fields. Winter, though, was a different story. You're hunkered down, conserving energy and warmth, with little time for passion when survival's on the line. You're pulling your cloak tighter, wondering if love can bloom when the wind's howling through the cracks. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some believed spring conceptions produced stronger babies, thanks to the vitality of new growth. So, couples timed their trysts for March or April. You're chuckling at the thought of villagers eyeing the first buds like a green light for romance, hoping for a hearty air by winter. Historians still argue whether this was widespread or just folklore, but you're betting it added extra spark to those May Day dances we saw. Either way, you're keeping an eye on the calendar, hoping the stars and the crops align for a fruitful year. The church, as we've seen, had its own calendar, with holy days like Lent banning sex to focus on penance, as we learned in those bedroom rule Sermons. You're counting days, frustrated that spring's warmth coincides with fasting and prayer, forcing you to postpone that cozy night with your spouse. Summer festivals offered a reprieve, loosening the church's grip, but winter's long nights brought their own challenges. Shared beds, like that crowded hovel, meant less privacy when the whole family's crammed in. You're whispering plans, hoping the kids and the goats stay asleep. Seasons shaped practical choices. 2. You're recalling those contraceptive brews, used more in lean winters to avoid another mouth when food was scarce. Spring and summer, with their promise of harvests, were safer for pregnancy, tying sex to survival. As we saw in those childbirth dangers, you're a husband, eager to grow your family, but you're also wary another child now could strain the pantry by February. You're balancing desire with caution, a dance as old as the seasons themselves. Joke number 1. You thought seasonal allergies were a buzzkill? Try planning romance around Lent and a dwindling grain bin. Gender roles played a part. If you're a woman, summer's lighter workload gave you more time to flirt or bond, like those weaving room moments, while winter trapped you indoors. Your intimacy dictated by the hearth's warmth. Men expected to provide, as we saw in those masculine pressures, were busier in planting and harvest seasons, leaving less energy for love. You're a man, exhausted from threshing, but catching your wife's smile by the fire stirs something. Even if you're half-dish asleep, the environment set the mood. You're stealing a summer kiss in a meadow, the grass soft and the air sweet, a far cry from winter's scratchy blankets and smoky huts. Festivals peaked in warmer months, as we saw, fueling passion, while winter's cold drove couples to bed for warmth, not always romance. You're remembering those noble bedchambers, where furs made winter cozy. Here, it's just you and a thin cloak, making every cuddle a necessity. Joke number 2. Forget mood lighting. Try sparking romance when the wind's rattling the shutters, and the cows eyeing your bed. There was magic in it. 2. You're sharing a quiet autumn night. The harvest done, your spouse's hand warm in yours as you talk of next year's hopes. These moments, like those hut whispers, were shaped by the season's rhythm, tying love to the earth's pulse. You're feeling the pull of time, each season a chapter in your story. From spring's promise to winter's endurance, as you head home, the frost crunching underfoot. You're struck by how the seasons wove sex into life's fabric. Desire wasn't just human, it was part of nature's cycle, bending to the sun and the cold. Joke number 3. You thought seasonal depression was rough? Try keeping the spark alive when the church, the weather, and the harvest are all conspiring against you. You're stepping into the hut, the fire's glow calling, ready to steal a moment before winter locks you in, heart and all. You're sitting by a flickering hearth in a village hut, the air heavy with the scent of damp wool and stew. As an old woman, her face creased like worn leather, spins a tale of her youth to a gaggle of wide-eyed grandchildren. In the middle ages, aging didn't just change your body, it reshaped your role in the bedroom, shifting how society saw your desires and duties. You're watching her laugh off a question about her long-ago suitors, but there's a glint in her eye that hints at stories untold. You're about to ponder how age altered sexual roles, from the vigor of youth to the wisdom of elders. In a world where time carved deep lines into love and lust, mainstream history tells us that medieval life was short. Many didn't reach their 50s, but those who did, like this grandmother, held unique places in their communities. You're an elder, and while youth drove the passion we saw in festival flirtations and noble affairs, age brought respect, authority, and sometimes a new kind of freedom in matters of the heart. The church, as we've seen, tied sex to procreation. So postmenopausal women and older men were often expected to step back, embracing chastity or spiritual love. You're feeling the weight of that expectation, but you're also noticing how some elders sidestepped it with a wink. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some believed older women could use love charms to attract younger men, brewing potions from nettles or reciting spells under the harvest moon, like those aphrodisiacs we explored. You're chuckling at the thought of this grandmother slipping a tincture into a young blacksmith's ale, claiming it's just herbal tea. Historians still argue whether these stories were about agency or just village gossip painting older women as witches. Either way, you're eyeing her sly grin, wondering if she's got a vial hidden in her apron. The church's rules, as we've seen, were strict, urging the elderly to focus on salvation over carnality. Like those monastic vows of celibacy, you're an older widow, and the priest expects you to live like a nun. But you're not ready to trade your warmth for a prayer book. Widows, as we saw in those women's desires, had more leeway than maidens or wives free from the marital debt. You could take a lover or remarry, though gossip, like that in the legal square, followed close. Men faced less scrutiny. An older man's fling, like those noble lords, was often shrugged off as a last hurrah, while women risked being called shameless. Age reshaped roles. If you're an older man, your virility, as we saw in those masculine expectations, isn't as central anymore. Your sons are plowing the fields now, and your legacy's set. You're free to court a younger bride for companionship, though village tongues wag if the age gap's too wide. Older women, past childbearing, were seen as matriarchs, their sexual desires dismissed or demonized. You're a grandmother, advising young brides on love, like those weaving room talks, but your own passions, those are whispered only to trusted friends. Joke number 1. You thought ageism was modern? Try being an elder told your heart's too old to race. Society's view was harsh, but flexible. You're noticing older couples, married decades, sharing a quiet intimacy that's less about heirs and more about comfort. A contrast to the duty-bound hut nights. Some elders, especially widows, lived alone or with other women, sparking rumors of bonds like those same-sex shadows we glimpsed. You're marveling at their defiance, knowing age didn't dull desire, it just made it sneakier. Like those cross-glass lovers dodging the Lord's wrath. The body changed, too. You're an elder, creaking joints and fading strength, making the straw mattress less inviting. But experience brought confidence. You're laughing with your spouse about old tricks that still work. A nod to the body humor we heard in that tavern. Yet, illness or frailty, like those childbirth dangers, could dim passion, and the church's push for abstinence felt like a convenient excuse. You're fighting to keep the spark, even if it's just a shared glance by the fire. There was wisdom in age. You're the grandmother, guiding a shy grandson through his first crush. Your story's softening the church's rules with lived truth. Your advice carries the weight of years, tying back to those practical courtships and festival sparks. You're a bridge between youth's fire and age's calm, and your voice matters. Joke number 2. Forget life coach podcasts. Try an elder's tale of love that outsmarted a priest and a bad harvest. As you lean closer to the hearth, her story ends, but her presence lingers. Age didn't erase desire, it reshaped it, blending passion with perspective. You're carrying her lessons, a reminder that love evolves but never fades, even when the world expects silence. Joke number 3. You thought wrinkles slowed you down? Try keeping up with a grandmother who's got more charm than a knight and twice the nerve. You're stepping into the night, heart warmed, ready to see desire through time's gentle lens. You're weaving through a lively village market, the air buzzing with the clatter of carts and the shouts of hawkers, as a young couple giggles openly, their hands brushing while they barter for apples. Nearby, a pair of lovers slips into the shadows of an alley, their whispers hidden by the crowd's din. In the Middle Ages, the line between public flirtations and private passions was blurry, a dance of boldness and secrecy shaped by watchful eyes and wagging tongues. You're watching these contrasts unfold, ready to explore how medieval folk balanced open displays of affection with the guarded intimacy we've seen in huts, castles, and stables. In a world where every gesture could spark gossip or glory, mainstream history tells us that medieval society was a stage, with public spaces like markets or churches serving as arenas for courtship, while private moments, like those marital debts or adulterous trysts, were fiercely guarded. You're a villager, and flirting in the open, as we saw at that raucous fair, was expected. Your banter over a loaf of bread signals your interest to the whole village. But anything to intimate, like a stolen kiss, risks the church's wrath or the legal fines. We met in that dusty square. You're tossing a playful wink to your crush, but you're keeping it light, knowing the priest's lurking nearby. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some couples used public hand-fasting ceremonies, clasping hands before witnesses to signal betrothal, a bold display that could double as cover for private rendezvous later. You're picturing the couple gripping hands in the market, their vows loud but their real plans whispered, much like those secret betrothals of cross-glass lovers. Historians still argue whether hand-fasting was about community approval or a sneaky way to bend the church's rules. Either way, you're cheering their hustle, hoping their public show keeps the bailiff off their trail. The church, as we've seen, policed desire with a vengeance, praising chaste courtship but condemning anything that smelled of lust, like those sin-obsessed sermons. You're keeping your market flirtations wholesome, a shared laugh, a gifted flower because a too long embrace could land you in confession. As we saw with those monastic temptations, secular society was just as nosy, villages thrived on gossip, and a public misstep could brand you a lecher or worse, as those brothel workers knew. You're smiling for the crowd, but your heart's racing for the alley's shadows. Joke number 1. You thought a viral TikTok was exposing. Try a market. Kiss when the whole village is your live audience. Public spaces were for performance. You're a young man showing off at a dance or wrestling match, like those festival feats, to catch a girl's eye. Your masculinity on display, as we saw in those bedroom expectations. Women, meanwhile, used subtle signals, dropping a handkerchief, lingering by the well because boldness, as we learned with women's desires, could backfire. You're a woman, and your coy glance is a calculated move, threading the needle between charm and chastity. Nobles, like those courtly lovers, played similar games at feasts, their public devotion masking private schemes. Private moments were sacred but rare. You're stealing a tryst in a barn, like that noble's stable affair, where the straw's prickly but the thrill's worth it. Privacy, as we saw in that crowded hovel, was a luxury. Most homes had thin walls, and servants or kin were always near, like those spying castle maids. You're whispering love in the dark, praying the snores drown you out, because private passion was a treasure in a world that demanded you perform for the public. Joke number 2. Forget locking your phone. Try locking your heart when your mother-in-law's got ears like a hawk. The tension between public and private fueled drama. You're hearing of a couple caught in a too cozy embrace at the harvest feast, now facing fines or a forced betrothal. Their public joy turned to private shame. Yet, some leaned into the spotlight, like those hand-fasting pairs, using public displays to legitimize their love before sneaking off. You're marveling at their nerve, knowing one wrong move could echo those adultery scandals or legal punishments. There was joy in both worlds. You're laughing with your lover in the market, your banter a public spark. Then later, in the quiet of a hidden nook, sharing a kiss that's yours alone. These moments, like those weaving room laughs or hut whispers, wove love into life's fabric. You're feeling the thrill of living on both stages, public and private, each fueling the other. Joke number 3. You thought switching from work mode to date night was a shift? Try flirting in the square while planning a tryst that'd make the priest faint as you leave the market. The couple's laughter fades, but their dance lingers. Public or private, love was a performance and a secret, a balance of defiance and desire. You're carrying their spark, a reminder that in a world of watchful eyes, every touch was a quiet victory. You're huddled in a dim village hut, the fire's glow casting shadows on rough walls as a mother whispers to her teenage daughter, pointing to the moon's phases, but dodging questions about where babies come from. In the Middle Ages, knowledge about sex and the body was a patchwork of myths, half-truths, and awkward silences, leaving most people young and old stumbling through desire and reproduction with more guesswork than guidance. You're listening to their halting talk, marveling at how little they know compared to the church's strict bedroom rules, or the physician's wild theories we've explored. You're about to dive into the gaps in medieval sexual education, where ignorance shaped lives as much as passion did, mainstream history tells us. That formal sex education didn't exist in the Middle Ages. Knowledge came from family, peers, or trial and error, often filtered through superstition and the church's lens. You're a young villager, piecing together the birds and bees from overheard tavern jokes, like those bawdy tales, or cryptic advice from elders, like that grandmother's stories. The church, as we've seen, preached sex was for procreation, but offered no practical details, leaving you clueless about your body's workings beyond sin and duty. You're blushing, wishing someone would just explain why your heart races around the miller's son. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some believed conception tied to the stars, with couples urged to avoid sex under a waning moon lest they birth a weak child, a notion echoing those seasonal rhythms we explored. You're squinting at the sky, wondering if last night's tryst was cosmically doomed or just bad timing. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were taken seriously or just filled the void of real knowledge. Either way, you're dodging moonlit nights, hoping the stars don't curse your future family. The church's silence was deafening. You're sitting through sermons, like those sin-obsestrants, that rail against lust but skip the mechanics of sex or pregnancy, leaving you to figure it out in the dark. Literally, in that crowded hovel, asking questions was risky. Probing too much could mark you as lewd, especially if you're a woman whose virginity we saw scrutinized in that village square. You're keeping quiet, relying on whispers from friends who are just as clueless. Their facts a mix of folklore and wishful thinking. Joke number 1. You thought a bad health class was confusing? Try learning about sex from a priest who thinks desire's a one-way ticket to hell. What little knowledge existed was gendered. If you're a boy, you're picking up tips from older men at the tavern, their boasts about conquests, like those masculine expectations, more bravado than biology. Girls, meanwhile, got vague warnings from mothers or midwives, often about childbirth dangers we witnessed, but rarely about pleasure. or consent, you're a girl. And your mother's talk of marital duties skips the how and why, leaving you terrified yet curious. Nobles fared slightly better, with access to physicians' bizarre theories, but even they fumbled. As we saw with those fertility myths, ignorance had consequences. You're hearing of couples shocked by pregnancy, unaware of how it happened, or others using risky contraceptives, like those wise women's brews, because no one explained safer ways. Misunderstandings fueled fear. Think of women accused of witchcraft for miscarriages, or men shamed for impotence, as we saw in those legal courts. You're wincing at the thought of trial and error in the bedroom, where mistakes could mean shame, sin, or a dangerous birth. Joke number 2. Forget Googling symptoms. Try guessing why your wife's expecting when you barely understand the act. Communities filled some gaps. You're catching snippets from market gossip or festival songs, like those body jests that hint at the body's secrets in coded ways. Midwives and wise women, as we saw with childbirth, shared practical wisdom, but their knowledge was oral, uneven, and often suspect in the church's eyes. You're grateful for the older women's hushed advice, but it's a patchwork, leaving holes big enough to trip over. You're recalling those women's weaving room talks, where experience bridged ignorance, but even there, clarity was rare. There was innocence, too. You're a teenager, stealing a kiss behind the barn like those public flirtations, driven by instinct, not understanding. And it's thrilling precisely because you don't know the rules. These moments, like those hut whispers, were raw and human, unburdened by the church's guilt or society's laws. You're smiling at the memory, even if it came with a scolding later. Joke number 3. You thought awkward first dates were bad. Try your first kiss when you think babies come from cabbage patches. As you step out into the night, the mother's voice fades, but the weight of their ignorance lingers. In a world obsessed with controlling sex, knowledge was the missing piece, leaving love to stumble in the dark. You're carrying their curiosity, a spark that burned despite the silence, ready to light your own path through a world that kept its secrets close. You're standing in a quiet village lane, the moon casting a silver glow over thatched roofs, the air soft with the hum of crickets and the distant murmur of a stream. The Middle Ages are behind you now, a tapestry of passion, struggle, and defiance woven through muddy huts, grand castles, and shadowy cloisters. You've walked through the raw realities of medieval sex, its rules, risks, and rare moments of tenderness, and you're ready to reflect on how those long-ago desires echo in our world today. This is the legacy of medieval love, a thread that stretches from their straw beds to our modern hearts, binding us to a past that shaped how we chase connection, even if the rules have changed. Mainstream history tells us that medieval attitudes toward sex rooted in church doctrine, social hierarchy, and survival laid the groundwork for Western views on marriage, gender, and desire. You're thinking back to those village courtships, where love was a practical pact, and seeing their shadow in today's debates over partnership and commitment. The church's grip, as we saw in those sin-obsessed sermons, left a lasting marks. Tension between guilt and pleasure still lingers in how we navigate intimacy. You're marveling at how their struggles, from marital duties to forbidden flings, mirror our own search for balance between freedom and fidelity. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval love tokens, like those ribbons we saw in courtly romances or market flirtations, inspired modern traditions like Valentine's cards or promise rings. You're picturing a knight's carved ring passed down through centuries, now sitting in a museum, its sentiment not so different from a heart-etched locket today. Historians still argue whether these tokens were mere gestures or deep symbols of devotion. But you're smiling, knowing a gifted flower in a medieval market carries the same flutter as a text, with a heart emoji now. The church's legacy, as we've seen, was double-edged. Its rules, from virginity's weight to same-sex taboos, shaped laws and norms that persisted. Think of marriage as a sacred contract, still a cornerstone today, or the slow unraveling of stigma around diverse loves, echoing those hidden monastic bonds. You're reflecting on how far we've come, yet how close we remain to their battles over who gets to love and how. Secular society, too, left its mark. The class divides we saw in those forbidden liaisons linger in modern status games, where wealth and power still color romance. You're wondering if our dating apps aren't just a shinnier version of the village squares. Matchmaking, gender roles, so rigid then, still cast shadows. You're recalling those women's desires, their quiet rebellions against a world that caged them, and seeing their fight in today's push for equality in love and agency. Men's pressures, like those virility expectations, echo in modern anxieties over performance or provision. You're struck by how their stories of weaving room whispers or tavern boasts parallel our own, even if we've traded straw mattresses for memory foam. Joke number 1. You thought modern gender norms were a maze? Try being a medieval woman flirting without losing your dowry, or a man proving his worth with a lance and a prayer. The raw humanity endures. You're remembering those festival laughs, those hut cuddles, those stolen stable kisses, moments where love defied church, law, or season. Today, we chase the same spark, whether in a swipe or a slow dance, proving desires timeless. Their ignorance, as we saw in that mother's faltering talk, has given way to knowledge. But the wonder of discovery, like those clumsy first kisses, remains. You're feeling a kinship, knowing their hearts raced as ours do, even if their world was harsher. The darker threads persist, too. You're thinking of those childbirth dangers, those brothel stigmas, those legal fines, reminders that love could cost everything. Modern freedom's contraception, consent, choice owe a debt to their struggles. But we still grapple with judgment, shame, or inequality, echoes of their church's shadow. You're grateful for progress, but you're carrying their resilience, a lesson in loving against the odds. Joke number 2. Forget dating app ghosting. Try loving when the priest, the Lord, and the village are all up in your business. As the lane fades, you're left with a glow, not just from the moon but from the stories, each a spark that lit the dark. Their legacy isn't just rules or ruins. It's the stubborn pulse of human connection, beating through time. You're stepping into your own world, heartful, ready to chase your own desires with a nod to those who loved before. Wind down, oh, let the village slip away. It's thatched, roofs dissolving into the soft haze of night. Picture yourself sinking into a warm, endless sea of stars, each one a story. Those lovers by the fire, those knights with their ribbons, those rebels who dared to feel. Their world was hard, but their hearts were fierce, and you carry that fire now, gentle and steady. Feel your breath slow, your shoulders ease, as the weight of their struggles melts into a whisper of hope. You're safe here, wrapped in the hum of history, where love, in all its messy glory, always finds a way. Let the stars cradle you, their light a promise that your own desires, like theirs, will shine through any dark. Close your eyes, drift, and let the night hold you close, soft as a lover's touch, until the morning calls. Sweet dreams.